Good morning. I want to welcome you. It's really great to see you here. My name is Ruth Ottman, and I am the Deputy Director of the Columbia Center for Research on Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications of Psychiatric, Neurologic, and Behavioral Genetics. And what I always say when I say the title of our center is that you win a prize if you can come up with a good acronym, because we can't. We do have one acronym, though, that we use, and it's PNB Genetics, Psychiatric, Neurologic, and Behavioral Genetics. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about our center, and then we can begin the actual program. So our center was funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute in 2013, and this is our second year. I realize now that I didn't mention the most important thing is that this center is directed by Paul Applebaum, and we're really very fortunate to have him as our director. So this is a quote from the NHGRI website talking about the Centers for Excellence in ELSI research, and summarizes the goal, which is really to bring investigators together to talk about and do research on the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics and genomic research. And there are 6 ELSI centers, and then 3 developing centers. And each of them is focused on a particular topic. Ours is really the only one that's focused on PNB genetics. We feel like we have particular strength in that area, obviously at Columbia, in both psychiatric and neurological disorders. We have a really beautiful website that is run collaboratively by the Hastings Center, who are important co-investigators in our center, and by Columbia. We also have, so the website has a wealth of information on it. It talks about publications from our center, the research that's funded by the center, as well as summaries of important papers in this area, both in psychiatric and neurologic genetics per se, and in ELSI issues. One of the important features of the website is something called the Brain Genetics Update, which is a monthly email that includes commentaries that refers to the website and includes commentaries and summaries of recent research, and it's a really great thing. The website is absolutely beautiful, as you can see from some of the screenshots here. And we also have a seminar series that is sponsored by the center, and here's a list of some of our recent speakers. So if you want to subscribe to the Brain Genetics Update or be on our mailing list, here are 2 email addresses you can use, including Paul Applebaum and Laura Tejeda. So we encourage you to do so. There is really a wealth of information available. Okay, so now if Key could help me make the transition. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for today, who's Dr. Jordan Smoler. Dr. Smoler is professor of psychiatry and epidemiology at Harvard. He holds many leadership positions at Mass General and also is an associate member of the Broad Institute. He's really a world leader in research on the genetic and environmental influences on psychiatric disorders. and has made a number of really important contributions to that field. His talk is entitled State of the Science, Current Understanding of the Genetic Contributions of Psychiatric Disorders. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, for the introduction. Thanks to you and to Paul for inviting me to speak today. This is, first of all, a great center and really the only of its kind, and that's a unique but important role to play because these issues are so quickly moving and so important and will only increasingly become so. So my job is actually to give you a snapshot of what we've learned about the genetic basis of psychiatric disorders, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a whirlwind tour of that, but hopefully get some of the basics across. So the first thing I want to just talk about is something about the why and how of psychiatric genetics. Why do we care, and how do we actually think about approaching the issue of whether genes play a role? And then I'll quickly give you an overview of what we've learned in terms of the role of what we call common variation, that is variance and risk genes that are common in the population, structural and rare variation, which talks about mutations that may be rare or changes to the chromosomes that may be rare but may actually have a large effect on risk. I'll talk a little bit about the theme that is emerging, that genetic influences on many psychiatric disorders actually overlap in ways that are surprising and intriguing, especially as we think about the nature of psychiatric diagnosis. And then quickly something about how we are beginning to see light at the end of the tunnel in terms of moving towards treatment. So a somewhat ambitious, but we'll give it a shot at this agenda. Okay, so let me start with the why and how. And obviously the why has to do with the fact that psychiatric disorders are tremendously common and leading causes of disability worldwide. This is probably familiar to many people here, but really outpacing cancer and heart disease combined when you think of the days lived with, or rather the disability-adjusted life years that are associated with these disorders. Now, if we're going to make progress in treatment and in relieving the suffering associated with these disorders, we have to have a good understanding of what they're about, how do they arise, what's responsible for risk, resilience, and all of these other things. And of course, if you ask psychiatrists that question, what are the causes of psychiatric disorders 50 years ago, you got a pretty simple answer, and it was actually turned out to be one person who was responsible, and that was the mother. And these are quotes that were not fringe ideas at the time in the 1950s and 60s, when predominantly psychoanalytic views of the causes of mental distress, particularly in the areas of autism and schizophrenia, really were generating ideas that created a lot of burden of guilt and shame for folks. And again, these were not out of the mainstream ideas. So in many ways, it was advances in genetics and neuroscience and other aspects of our understanding of the evidence base for psychiatric research that has moved us beyond that era, fortunately. Although, of course, as we'll talk about in the course of this morning, I think it's raised other issues. But let me just talk about how do you even begin to approach the question of whether genes influence a psychiatric disorder. And this is actually true for a variety of common medical or behavioral conditions. And this may be a little bit hard to see, but basically there's a kind of sequencing of questions and studies that people pursue, beginning with the obvious question of whether something might run in families. And to do that, you undertake a family study where you're actually asking simply whether the condition is more common in first-degree relatives of somebody who has it than it is in first-degree relatives of somebody who doesn't have it. And you can get an index of that called the recurrence risk ratio, which is basically how much more likely are you to have this condition if you're the first-degree relative of somebody who has it, compared to if we selected you at random from the population. Now, things run in families for reasons that might not have to do with genetics per se. And so the next step is often to try to tease apart what component of that familial aggregation, if you see it, is attributable to genetic differences among people. And that's where twin studies typically come in. Here we get another kind of index of the strength of genetic influences, which is referred to as the heritability, which is really the proportion of variation in the population in this trait that's attributable to individual differences in genes or genetic variation. So it's really a kind of population measure of how influential genetic variation is. But then if you actually can convince yourself that genes are playing a role, you might want to go on and try to find those genes. Where are they in the genome? What specific genetic risk factors there might be? And again, here we get into a series of studies that actually take us into the lab. These were only possible in the last 30 years or so, whereas these have been going on for quite some time. So linkage studies, which look at where in the genome there might be a risk locus, association studies that come in many flavors, looking at candidate genes, that is, genes that we think might be involved based on some prior evidence, or genome-wide association studies, or copy number variant studies, we'll talk about this a little bit, or increasingly sequencing of all of the DNA or all of the protein coding regions of the DNA to try to find mutations that may be rare. So that can give you a flavor of what the genetic architecture, as we call it, might be. What are the genetic risk factors involved? There's another layer, because we know that genes are not the whole story and that genes and environment have this kind of inextricable interplay. So people are interested in the interaction between genetic variants and the environment. Those studies are of great interest. And then all of this is prelude to a whole series of things which would take many more slides, which is that if you identify genetic variants that are involved, that's sort of the beginning of the story, because you then want to know, if you want to understand the biology and how you get from genotype to phenotype, how's that actually working? And that's a whole area of science and series of studies that might involve molecular assays and animal models and imaging and all kinds of things. So let's just briefly talk about where we are with all of this. The first part is the genetic epidemiology, that is the family and twin study data. And this just gives you a sense for a number of psychiatric related conditions, what that recurrence risk ratio is, or familial relative risk. Again, how much more likely are you to be affected compared to the general population if you have a first-degree relative? And the heritability. So for schizophrenia, for example, there's a 10-fold increased risk for first-degree relatives, and there's about an estimate of heritability that's about 85%. These are substantial. They vary a lot. But by comparison, here's breast cancer, which has a familial risk of about 2-fold. And a heritability of about 27%, which is surprising when we think of the fact that high penetrance mutations that influence breast cancer were found 20 years ago, and we're still sort of struggling with many of these conditions which actually have higher heritability. Part of the answer to that apparent disconnect is the fact that, for example, the heritability doesn't actually tell you much about how many genes might be involved, what their individual penetrance or effect size might be. It's an overall summary of the influence of genetic differences. But the point to take away from this is that genetic variation is clearly playing a role in practically every psychiatric condition that has been studied, maybe all of them. The other thing to bear in mind now is so we have maybe sufficient evidence to go and try to find genes that might be involved, but the key sort of insight that emerged over time is that mental disorders, psychiatric conditions are complex. They are not the sort of classic Mendelian kinds of scenario that we're all familiar with from biology class, where you have something like Huntington disease, where you might have a mutation in a parent and 50% of the offspring inherit the mutation and are therefore affected, because if you have the mutation, you're affected. Or it might require 2 copies of a mutation, like cystic fibrosis. But here we're talking about highly complex phenotypes that involve many genetic variations. Some of them might be tiny contributors, and they might need to interact with other parts of the genetic background or with environments to even have a noticeable effect. So it's a much different kind of scenario. And it also makes the research much more complicated because you're looking for, thousands of needles in a haystack, each of which are very hard to find. But this has been, in fact, the work that's been going on for 20 years or so. And the most common kinds of studies that we do are in the realm of association studies, which are basically asking which genes, which genetic variants are involved, and really asking a sort of simple question. Is there some correlation between a particular genetic variant and the trait of interest, whether that's depression or diabetes or IQ? And there are many kinds of genetic variation in our genomes. The most common kind are single nucleotide variants, single nucleotide polymorphisms, and also rare single nucleotide variants, which are basically a single letter change. But there are all kinds of other things going on: insertions, deletions of base pairs, inversions, large copy number variants, which this is just sort of a schematic of, but talking about chunks of DNA that may be 1 million bases that are deleted or duplicated. But this is what we're doing for the most part, looking for some correlation between some kind of variation and our phenotype. So let's start with the common variation. Now, up until maybe 10 years ago, the only way you could really look at this, when we're talking about common variation, we're talking about genetic variants that may be carried by 5% or more of the population. And those were the ones we were studying, and the only way to look at it was to place some bets. We had to place some bets on what genes we thought might be involved because we couldn't look at the whole genome. And that was the era of candidate gene association studies. Basically what we were doing was saying, well, if I want to see whether there's a gene involved in depression, I have to think about what gene should I look at, which is a tough call because we don't know that much about the biology. But there were some commonly looked at genetic variations, which can be referred to as the usual suspects. And those typically were variants in pathways and receptors that we thought were involved based on the fact that, for example, serotonin is a target of our common treatments, or dopamine is a target of antipsychotic treatments. So people sort of studied these over and over. The most widely studied one, which you don't need to see the details of here, but this is a polymorphism, a variant of a gene, the serotonin transporter on chromosome 17. The serotonin transporter, of course, is the target of SSRI antidepressants, the extremely widely used medications for treatment of depression. And it turns out that there was a variant in the promoter of this gene, that is the part that regulates how active the gene is. Some people carry a version of that that's missing 44 base pairs of DNA compared to the other variants. So you have a short and a long variant. And this was incredibly appealing as a candidate gene because, first of all, it was common. In European American populations, the frequency of this short variant was about 45%, is about 45%. It's functional. It affects the activity of the gene. It's the target of the antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. And so beginning about 20 years ago now, there were the first reports that this variation is associated with anxiety, which made some sense, and also with unipolar depression, which also makes sense. And with antidepressant response, which makes sense because, again, variance in this target of the antidepressants is highly plausibly related to whether they're going to work for you or not. And also bipolar disorder, which makes some sense as well. And also schizophrenia and suicide and migraine and ADHD and OCD and impulsivity and MI and smoking and periodontitis is going to show up there in a minute. So this is what happened. It was a common, easily studied gene, and this is a partial list of the conditions that have been associated with this. So this, as I like to say, is either the source of all human suffering, or many of these are probably not real associations. And that's probably the latter. The latter is probably true. Now, the game sort of changed in the 21st century because we had these breakthroughs in genomic science, beginning with the sequencing of the human genome, and then some large, big science projects that cataloged variation, common and rare variation across populations, and led to the development of tools, genome-wide association microarrays, and ultimately sequencing technologies, or at least assisted in the interpretation of that. And then more recently, a lot of work on the function of the genome. And this has really accelerated progress and in many ways changed the game. There's always this balance with the progress and acceleration of the science between our exuberance about what is now possible. And I try to kind of moderate that because it's easy to get a little bit carried away and we don't want to overhype things. But there's that sort of balance because expectations get very high when we talk about how quickly things are moving. And people sometimes expect that we're on the cusp of identifying the totality of genetic contributions to behavior and all kinds of other things. And this is my favorite example of this. When you're on the phone with somebody and they say, I'll let you go now, like they're doing you some kind of favor, but it's really them that wants to get off the phone and they just don't want to admit it. I think I've isolated the gene for that. That's a notion that I think people had as we were moving into this era. And of course, that's not where we are. This is at least 5 years away. So, but here's the thing. Before 2008, we really, if you asked people, tell me a genetic variant that you know, and everybody agrees is associated with a psychiatric condition, there was pretty much nothing to say. And then in the last 6, 7 years, we've seen this tremendous inflection. And one of the reasons for this, a principal reason, was that we suddenly were able to look across the whole genome and do much larger studies and essentially ask questions we couldn't ask before. So beginning around 2008, 2009, we began to see variants and genes associated with psychiatric conditions that have held up, that unlike many of the candidate gene stories, have been replicable. This is one of the first for bipolar disorder from a large international consortium which involved more than 4,000 cases and 6,000 controls, which at the time was very large because typically these studies involved 100, 200 people. And there were a couple of things that emerged from this that told a story that has continued to play out. One of them is if you don't place the bets in advance and you actually let the data tell you what's lighting up in the genome, essentially, what's associated, you learn things you never suspected before. Like that anchorin 3, a gene that was on nobody's list of usual suspects, is a risk gene for bipolar disorder, or a subunit of an L-type voltage-gated calcium channel. That's exciting because this is actually telling you something you didn't know, pointing you in directions that hadn't been anticipated. That's sort of our goal if we're trying to open the black box of what's going on biologically. The other thing that emerged from this, which has played out, is that you need very large studies and that the kinds of effects that you're picking up are typically, or often, very small on their own. We're talking about odds ratios of 1.1, 1.2 or less. So a tiny increase in risk. And that recognition by the scientific community that we needed to go much bigger led to something that has also sort of changed the game in the field, and that was the development of the Psychiatric GWAS Consortium, or now called the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, which was an effort by scientists around the world to work together in a way that people hadn't been doing before. And work together in a really remarkable way, because this has been a sort of sea change in the way people have done science. Instead of simply agreeing to replicate each other's findings, this is a consortium which has agreed to put together their raw data and analyze the data together, sometimes even before research groups have published their own data. Because there's this recognition we have to work together if we're going to make real advances in this field. And this has played out in ways that I think have paid off. One of them, more recently, one of the recent findings that has emerged was from the schizophrenia work group of this consortium, which last summer reported the identification of 108 schizophrenia-associated genetic loci. What you're looking at here, for those who don't typically look at genome-wide association studies, is something called a Manhattan plot, which is basically a snapshot of a genome-wide association study in one picture. And so what you have along the bottom are the chromosomes 1 to X, 1 to 22 and X. And each of these dots which sort of coalesce into blobs at the bottom, are individual genetic markers that have been studied. And then on the y-axis is the strength of statistical evidence in favor of an association. And this is given as, instead of the p-value, minus log of the p-value. So 12 here means p-value of less than 10 to the minus 12th, which is very, our typical threshold is 0.05, which is 5 times 10 to the minus 2. This line is what we use for a threshold for genome-wide significance. It's got to be a less than 5 times 10 to the minus 8th level of significance, which is very stringent. And you can see there are things that are, this is why it's called a Manhattan plot, which you'll recognize if you walk out the door here, right? You've got skyscrapers and tall buildings and so on. So that's incredibly exciting. We've gone from practically nothing to over 100 in a short span of time, 100 new leads to follow up. We also have to be, again, mindful of the complexity that we're talking about, because the recent simulations suggest that there are a lot more than 100 variants that are contributing to schizophrenia, something on the order of maybe 8,500. And so if you look at it that way, we've identified here about 2% of what's out there potentially. And that's just the common variation. But these are new leads. These are new insights into biology that we didn't have before, which is, I think, really exciting and not to be underestimated. The other thing that emerges from these common variant genome-wide studies is the ability to try to aggregate some of this genetic signal to create what people call genetic risk scores or polygene risk scores. That is, take these tiny little effects, but then add them into a score that represents kind of the genetic loading in terms of common variation for a condition. And this is a figure that comes from that same paper, which is a little bit hard to see just because of the lighting here. But essentially what was done was to take a genetic risk score derived from these large genetic studies and then apply them to individual separate samples and ask how predictive are they of risk. So while each individual variant might have an odds ratio of 1.1, it tells you nothing about somebody's individual risk that you didn't really know before. If you add them up, you start to see something a little bit more impressive. So if you divide this risk score into deciles, the top 10%, top 20%, 30%, et cetera, if you compare the top 10% of risk loading to the bottom, you're starting to see something like an 8 to 20-fold increased risk when you put it all together. Still not enough to be diagnostically useful, but now we're talking about something a little bit more impressive, and we can see that even adding up these common variant risks can make a difference. Now, the story hasn't been so simple for something like depression, where the largest genome-wide association studies have so far not really yielded much. There is a much larger effort now going on, which may give us a slightly different story. But even with fairly large samples, we're not picking up much. And in fact, we can exclude anything that has a very large effect. In these studies, a large effect would be an odds ratio of like 1.4 or something. So why is that? Why is it harder for depression? There's a lot of debate about that. One answer, which is probably part of it, is that as big as those studies were, we need bigger studies, much bigger studies. And the simulations suggest that maybe you need about a 5-fold greater sample size than what we had for schizophrenia. We're also not taking into account in any of these studies really gene-gene interaction or gene-environment interaction, which may be important. And then there's this big issue about how we define the phenotype, how we make the diagnosis, how we decide that somebody's affected or not in a study like this, which is incredibly complicated. And you can see that it would be ripe for misclassification and imprecision. And maybe depression is not one thing, but it's 10 things, subtypes of which are more genetically influenced, or at least in a more homogeneous and detectable way. So maybe there's a lot of more work to be done, but clearly sample size is a part of it. And in fact, what we see now, not just in the genetics of psychiatry, but in complex disease in general, is that there tends to be an inflection point with respect to sample size, after which, if you hit that point and you keep adding and growing your studies, you get a steady increase in the number of variants that you have. So, but for different disorders, that inflection point happens in different places. For Crohn's disease, it happened pretty quickly. For schizophrenia and height, it happened at around 15, close to 20,000 individuals. After that, it kind of takes off in a fairly steady way, so that for schizophrenia, for every 1,000 individuals who are added, we're picking up about 4 more genetic loci. And the latest simulations suggest that for depression, we might not get to this point till about 50 or 75,000. So that's common variation in a nutshell. Structural and rare variation I want to mention just briefly. The structural variation is focused on copy number variation. Again, these are chunks of DNA that are duplicated or deleted and that can have large effects sometimes, particularly rare de novo, that is sort of not inherited copy number variants, which are also known to be associated with advanced paternal age. There's one that has been known in psychiatry for quite some time, a deletion of part of chromosome 22, which is variably called the DeGeorge syndrome or velocardiofacial syndrome, and appears to be associated with about a 20 to 30-fold increased risk of schizophrenia or psychotic illness, about a 20 to 30% absolute risk. So that's a huge risk factor, but it's rare. Copy number variants in autism are now increasingly recognized, and there's a whole panoply of copy number variants that are now documented to increase the risk of autism, although again, these are rare and are found in maybe 5 to 10% of individuals, but that's, again, a set of clues that we didn't have. There's also another kind of sort of rare variation that we haven't been able to really look at until recently. And remember, I was talking about the genetic architecture, that is how many variants are involved, what their effect sizes are, and you get a kind of distribution here. So in terms of the frequency, how common these things are, and in terms of their effect size. And typically, there's a sort of inverse relationship. The kinds of things we're picking up in these genome-wide association studies have typically been things that are carried by at least 5 to 10% of people in the population and have a small effect. Mendelian diseases, which we've found over 1,000 mutations involved in, are very rare but have a very high penetrance. There could be things that are very strong effect and common, but probably not a lot of those, especially if they have a deleterious effect on reproduction, for example. There could be things that are tiny effects and really rare, and maybe we don't care that much about those. But then there's this whole part of the spectrum that we weren't able to really see until recently, because these are things that are relatively rare, moderately penetrant, and to pick them up, you really need to sequence the genome. And that has now become feasible on a large scale, and people have probably seen this, this picture before, but it's an indication of this dramatic decrease in the cost, and there's a comparable decrease in the time needed to sequence the human genome, so that it's possible to do not one genome in 15 years, like the Human Genome Project, but many genomes in a day, and not have it cost $3 billion, but more like a couple $1,000. So this has opened up a new avenue and has been applied in our realm, particularly in neurodevelopmental disorders, so exome sequencing, the exome being, of course, the protein coding part of the genome, less than 2% of our genome, but where a lot of the action is. And sequencing of the exome has led to the identification of a number of gene mutations, particularly around the synapse and genes that are involved in the structure and function of the synapse that seem to clearly be risk genes for autism. But again, here the picture is complicated. And when we look at the genetic architecture, there's a lot of variety going on. There's a whole spectrum of allelic contributions. So this is from an analysis that showed that about close to half of the liability, the sort of heritability or the liability rather to autism spectrum disorder is from common variation. A smaller part is from known rare de novo variation or rare inherited variation. And there's a lot we just don't know. There's been some interesting work recently suggesting that the kind of phenotypic expression of the rare and common variation may be a little bit different. This is work from Mark Daly's group and others suggesting that the common variation that contributes may also be associated with familial risk for other neuropsychiatric disorders, whereas the rare variation may be associated with more significant impairments in IQ and function and more severe symptoms. There is, however, loss of function mutations in an estimated 400 to 1,000 different genes that might contribute to autism. And you may have seen recent work suggesting that if you look at families in which two children are affected, much of the time you see different mutations affecting those kids, suggesting that there is heterogeneity of cause even within families. That's how complicated it is. We're also now seeing exome sequencing and rare variation studies in schizophrenia, which again are telling a story that there are certain pathways, certain disruptions around the synapse and some other key pathways that seem to be involved in rare variants that contribute to this disorder. So let me move on quickly to gene-environment interaction, another slice of the pie, as we mentioned. And one of the most influential studies, if not the most influential study in this area, was from Caspi and colleagues. This was now 12 years ago, a very impactful study which found that serotonin transporter polymorphism we talked about was associated with depression, suicidality, but only in combination with stressful life events. So if you had one or two copies of the short allele, didn't matter so much except as you acquired more and more stressful life events. So this was a very clear gene-environment interaction. It spawned a whole series of studies and attempts to replicate. There's a lot of debate still about that finding, and recent critical reviews of the area have suggested that that finding and many others in the candidate gene association world have not really been convincingly replicated, and that there is a problem of probably false positives, publication bias, and other things, which really needs to be resolved with further study. There have been a couple of cases where gene-environment interaction has gone a little bit deeper than simply that statistical interaction, and probably the best example of that has been work done by Elizabeth Binder's group on a gene called FKBP5, which is a gene that is involved in cortisol and glucocorticoid receptor biofeedback or feedback regulation. And I won't go through the details on this in the interest of time, but they have actually shown in a series of studies evidence that a variant in this gene interacts with particularly childhood maltreatment or trauma to increase the risk of PTSD or depression, that is stress-related conditions, to influence the cortisol response to stress, and at a deeper level, illuminated the potential function of this by showing that the risk allele changes the conformation of the transcription machinery around this gene by inducing differences in the chromatin and a kind of conformation of how the enhancers and promoters link up that drive expression of this locus, and also by inducing DNA methylation changes that epigenetically dysregulate this cycle. That's an example of going beyond statistical interaction to trying to illuminate this sort of biological interaction that I think we're going to see more of this kind of thing. I did want to mention this other theme, which I think is fascinating, whether you're involved in genetic research or not, because it says something about how we think about psychiatric disorders and the nature of them. And that is the phenotype problem. So the DSM, of course, if we want to define phenotypes in psychiatry, we have an advantage relative to other fields, perhaps, in that we can kind of go to the bookshelf, get the criteria, and make the determination pretty easily. But of course, we know that that set of criteria, that nosology, has really been evolving. And here you have the growth of the DSM in terms of these are diagnostic labels, starting with DSM-1 to DSM-5, suggesting that there's a kind of instability, at least, in how we define the boundaries among psychiatric disorders. And interestingly, if you look at the genetic epidemiology, even before a lot of the molecular genetic studies were being done, they were starting to already paint a picture through family and twin studies that if you tried to sort of draw the DSM, you would get something like this. Not these discrete categories, but tremendous overlap in depression and anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and so on. But now that we actually can interrogate the genome, we're starting to see some of this validated at the level of genetic variation. One of the places that that has been most strongly seen has been in the area of rare copy number variations, these large chunks of DNA, again, that are duplicated or deleted. And a number of these have been associated with or shown to be risk factors for a broad range of neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric phenotypes. So what you're looking at here are the copy number variants. In some cases, there are specific gene names that are associated with these copy number variations. And these are conditions that CNVs and these particular CNVs have been associated with, ranging from autism to intellectual disability, schizophrenia, ADHD, epilepsy, a lot of pleiotropy or crossing of boundaries in terms of their effects. We're also seeing this at the common variant level and at the level of sort of SNPs. And this is work from our cross-disorder group of the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, which involved a study of 5 different disorders that we think of as quite different clinically, a very large analysis. And we were able to identify a number of genetic variants in a series of genes that cross these diagnostic boundaries. That's interesting because we think of some of these as quite distinct. When we actually look at this at a more aggregate level across the genome, we can look at genetic correlations overall between these conditions. And you can see that schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are highly correlated at the level of common variation or genes, which is interesting because you think about those 2 conditions, they are the foundation of our classification system as being 2 distinct kinds of things. They're mutually exclusive in terms of being diagnoses, and we're seeing that they have quite a bit of genetic overlap, at least at the level of the genome. We're now engaged in much larger studies, both in terms of the size of the samples, but also by including additional work groups and disorders in these cross-disorder kinds of analyses. And finally, I want to just say a word about how this could translate to something related to maybe precision medicine or treatment. And one of the things that has emerged that has been particularly exciting, I think, is that we're not simply now getting this list of genetic variants and copy number variants that are associated with these disorders, but we're starting to see the outlines of a biological story in some cases. As we fill in more of these tiny little sort of pointillist elements of this tapestry, they are beginning to coalesce into biological pathways. So from that cross-disorder analysis I just showed you, we found that genes involved in calcium channel signaling seem to have effects across those 5 diagnostic categories. We've done other work suggesting that genes involved in glial cell function and structure are involved in schizophrenia, and many other people have done these kinds of studies as well. These are called pathway analyses. What you're actually asking is, if you kind of aggregate the effects, even though they may individually not even be statistically significant, but if you aggregate the variants that are involved, do they sort of stand out in terms of some kind of biological pathway? Are they enriched for genes that are involved in some biological system? And that's what we're beginning to see. And in fact, the pathway analysis group of the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium just published a paper looking across schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression, and finding 3 kinds of groupings of pathways that seem to be key across these disorders. And those were pathways, and each of these little boxes is a specific pathway, which I'm not showing you in the interest of not torturing you. But synaptic genes, genes involved in histone methylation and chromatin, immune and neuronal and neurotrophic pathways as well. That's exciting because this is possibly how we're going to get to novel treatments. And as you probably know, despite the fact that we've had at least medication therapies for decades, we haven't really had anything new since the 1960s in terms of mechanism, in terms of the biology underlying our psychopharmacologic interventions. They're all based on a fairly simple biological hypothesis. So now as we begin to piece together the biology in this way, we may finally have novel treatment targets. And people are beginning to think about how do we get from that to actually developing new treatments, for example, new drug treatments. There are many ways to do this. One of the sort of sequences or pathways that people imagine and is actually now undergoing development in lots of places, both in academia and in industry, is to begin with these confirmed genetic insights, which we really didn't have before. That's part of the power of the genes, is to tell us something about the biology. With that in hand, you can then begin to characterize how those genes work. How do they act in experimental models like induced pluripotent stem cell models or animal models? We can now use genome editing to actually engineer specific variations into those models. Develop cell-based assays and then screen assays of these kinds of functions, screen millions or even billions of chemical compounds to see how they affect those pathways, develop target compounds out of these screens, and then do the usual kinds of things to ensure their safety and efficacy. Sometimes there's a little bit of a shortcut that we luck into because it may turn out that in our screening, there is already a drug available or on the market that actually does what we were looking for. That's in some ways the best outcome. And that does occasionally occur. We're seeing hints of this in psychiatry. This is a very preliminary but interesting analysis of isradipine, which is a cardiovascular medication for hypertension, heart disease. And based on those genetic findings that L-type voltage-gated calcium channel signaling genes might be involved, this was an open trial of using isradipine for bipolar depression and finding improvements in depression. So, again, just a hint of the kind of thing that might be possible. So I'll wrap up by just saying something about what might be ahead. And this is, well, although with the way things are going, it's hard to say exactly when these things might occur. But there's a lot of movement towards sequencing our genomes and introducing those kinds of data into our medical care. That's rapidly progressing, at least as an endpoint. Precision medicine, using genetic profiles to sort of target treatments, match treatments to patients, optimize outcomes, and minimize toxicities. There's a lot of work in pharmacogenetics and psychiatry, which I think I can summarize by saying has not yet produced any profiles that are capable of doing this. I just mentioned using these genetic findings to develop new treatments. That's very actively being pursued now in many quarters. And possibly the fraught but perhaps important goal of prevention, identifying risk and resilience factors that might alter the trajectory towards illness or improve recovery. So just to summarize, I think here are a few takeaways. Psychiatric disorders we know are familial and heritable, but complex and highly polygenic, many genes involved. Some of them large effect genes that are rare, some of them, or variants that are rare, some of them tiny effects from common variants, but we are starting finally to make those advances. We're also seeing that the DSM has not read, the DNA has not read the DSM. That is, the genetic influences do not conform neatly into the DSM categories. Although, we know from the twin studies that those are heritable categories. So that's not to say that they're not capturing what's, an important part of what's going on. I think excitingly, the findings are coalescing into these biological stories, which give us a pathway to possibly new treatments. And all of this is addressing the hope and the need, I think, that we began with, which is to better understand the biology, to better understand risk factors, whether they're genetic risk factors or the environmental elements that increase or reduce vulnerability, develop better treatments than the ones we have, which, while life-saving sometimes, are clearly not effective for everybody and often cause tremendous toxicity, and perhaps giving us new insights into diagnosis and classification, which I think is an interesting whole theme and side area of what's emerging from this. So I'm going to stop there and thank you for having me again. Actually, it's more like 5 times the rate for schizophrenia. Those are the estimates. And that's purely, those simulations are purely based on the heritability and prevalence of it. So it's just sort of based on what we know about the epidemiology and overall genetic variance. That's what you would predict. But it could be actually much more than that because of these other factors, like the fact that we may be not precisely capturing the phenotype in the way we diagnose it. So in some ways, that might be the floor of what we need to begin to hit that inflection point. We'll find things before that, possibly, but we won't hit that kind of trajectory until it looks like later than that. And it's a combination of just the increased polygenicity that is expected based on its prevalence and heritability, but then all bets are off about whether we're even measuring it correctly.
As you think about this first talk this morning, if you have more questions, we've allowed time for questions after Dr. Applebaum's talk too. So there's plenty of time for discussion. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Paul Applebaum, who is the Elizabeth K. Dollard Professor of Psychiatry, Medicine, and Law at Columbia, and also, as you know, is the director of our Center for Excellence in ELSI Research. He's written widely and is recognized internationally for his research on ethical and legal issues in medicine, particularly as they relate to psychiatry and genomics. The title of his talk is the very creative Twists in the Double Helix, Ethical and Legal Challenges in the Implementation of Precision Medicine in Psychiatry.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks to all of you for joining us this morning, and for Jordan to come down and give that great talk and inspire us all to do better and livelier PowerPoint presentations. So the focus of the issues I'm going to focus on today relate to something that, as is clear from the presentation you just heard, is somewhere down the road. It's not a today issue so much as it is a tomorrow set of issues. And that is that as tests become available for genes that are associated with psychiatric disorders, there will be a set of issues that we'll look at that will arise. And let me just say up front, the apparent nature of the genetics of psychiatric disorders is likely to affect the shape and dimensions of these issues to the extent that what we're dealing with are polygenic disorders where many genes contribute relatively small portions of the variance. The issues that we face are going to be somewhat different than we see in other areas of medicine where you've got Mendelian traits or something close to that in terms of high levels of penetrance. Nonetheless, as we gain knowledge and begin aggregating genes to increase our predictive power, these are the issues that we're going to be facing, and it seems prudent for us to begin thinking now about exactly how we intend to deal with them. So starting more or less chronologically through the lifespan, I want to begin with prenatal testing because one of the things that we will face sooner rather than later is whether parents should be allowed or even encouraged to test their fetuses to decide whether to continue with a pregnancy or not. Today, of course, women can decide to terminate pregnancies on any ground at all. That is their legal right, at least before the point of viability. But there are more than individual issues involved in making these determinations. To the extent that we begin systematically making such choices and pulling certain alleles out of the gene pool, the population as a whole may be affected. So, for example, there's been a long-standing body of research on the relationship between creativity and mood disorders. And you all have seen the lists of composers, artists, novelists, poets, and other creative types with histories of depression or bipolar disorder. There are theories as to why that might be, something about experiencing the intensity of moods that are inherent in moderate to severe mood disorders that somehow heightens their sensitivity to the experiences that we all have in the world and enables them to channel that into creative works. If in fact one of the reasons for that concurrence of psychiatric predisposition and creative output is because of that downstream effect of a genetic propensity for the disorder. To the extent that we pull those genes out of the gene pool, we may succeed in reducing the rate of mood disorders, but we may also suppress the overall population rate of creative output as well. And those will be decisions that are made on an individual basis, but with a much broader effect. Interestingly, these are data from a study in Denmark of a mixed population of patients, students, family members of people with psychiatric disorders, etc. But it showed that somewhere between 2/3 and 4/5 of respondents said that they would have an abortion if a genetic test showed a 75% risk of moderate, even a moderate psychiatric illness consistent with normal life. And I think what the authors here had in mind was, in fact, a depressive disorder. Now, whether we ever get to a test that could actually demonstrate a 75% risk is an enormous question in its own right. And whether, once pregnant, people would in fact make the decision to terminate a pregnancy on this basis is very hard to know, because what we all tell interviewers or respond to on internet-based surveys is often very different from what we do in real life when the opportunity presents itself. Nonetheless, the data, I think, are suggestive of what could be down the road as we increasingly are able early in the course of pregnancy, and non-invasive prenatal testing has given us a mechanism for doing that. The folks I talk to in genetics seem pretty sure that within 5 years we will be able to do fetal sequencing on the basis of a sample from maternal blood, and the entire range of genomic information will be available to us. The consequences of that are, I think, worth pondering. Would prenatal testing of this sort be used? This is a study done by Linda Lisi and a colleague not quite a decade ago, surveying family members, clinicians, and researchers, all who treated, did research on, or were related to someone who had schizophrenia. And they were asked more realistically to assume that only a small percentage of people with the identified gene, but now I think we would say the set of genes or set of alleles, gene variants, would develop the disorder. 56% of family members said they would opt for prenatal testing. A similar percentage of the clinicians said they would recommend it, and 25% of the researchers said they would recommend it. I think this number is interesting when you've lived with schizophrenia in your family. The prospect of being able to test for it prenatally may seem much more compelling. Children. Should parents be allowed to test their children for predisposition to adult onset disorders? The Nuffield Council on Bioethics in England has a great report which you can find online about this question, and their conclusion is the general conclusion of experts in this area, which is the answer is no, unless intervention is possible during the minority of the child. Otherwise, the experts concur, we should wait until a child is of majority, him or herself, and allow the child, now adult, to make a decision about what they want to know or don't know. Let me tell you as a parenthetical here that on the basis of interviewing and surveying family members and knowing the data that other people are accumulating around the country as well, this is decidedly not most parents' views. Most parents will tell you, if you ask them, if it were available, I would definitely want to know everything I could about my child's genetics, even about predispositions to adult onset disorders, even untreatable disorders. And if you ask them why, they will in some way say, maybe there's something we can do. Maybe we can help our child prepare for it. We're not sure, but we want to know that information. So there's an enormous demand, even given the expert consensus otherwise. But I want to focus here on this criterion that we shouldn't get the information unless intervention is possible. And I want to think back to Dr. Smoller's reference to the serotonin transporter data, which admittedly continue to be contentious, but let's assume we believe the Caspi et al. Findings of a gene-environment interaction between levels of stress and a particular allele of the transporter, and ask, is that enough of a finding? Assuming that this relationship were confirmed to warrant testing a child. And what would the consequences be of trying to protect vulnerable children from stress? Does that mean that Johnny doesn't get to participate in Little League because if his team lost, he'd be crushed, and that might precipitate a depressive episode or set one up later in life? Those of you who, as I do, live here in Manhattan and watch some of the parenting that goes on out on Broadway or the subways or elsewhere, know that the limits of parental protectiveness are extremely difficult to define. Wouldn't be surprising to see parents making those kinds of choices, and not necessarily beneficial choices in the long run for their kids. If you go back to that Danish sample, 46% said they would test their kids if an intervention were available. Again, that begs the question of what is enough of an intervention. And 26% said they would test even if it weren't. And in my experience talking to parents, that's low because you get much higher rates of folks telling you, I just want to know. I just want to know. Adoptees or potential adoptees are another set of children for which testing is likely to be used when available. We all know that rates of psychopathology are elevated in adoptive children. We all know there's a nature-nurture controversy as to why that is. I can tell you that just in the last couple of weeks, I saw a report that a lawsuit was filed by a family that had adopted a child and later, I'm sorry, not adopted, but this was a sperm donor situation. They had had a sperm donation to enable the wife to become pregnant. Child was born, and they discovered after the fact that the sperm donor had a family history of schizophrenia and sued the sperm bank, alleging that they should have been told, that it was negligent not to tell them about the sperm donor's family history. So there's enormous sensitivity to particularly stigmatized disorders and severe disorders like schizophrenia. Were we able to identify genes that elevated the rate of psychopathology in adoptive kids, even marginally, I suspect, you would see a group of genetically tainted unadoptables being created, and parents simply potential parents simply shying away from becoming involved with those kids. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'll leave to you to decide. But note that even a doubling of the risk of schizophrenia means there's a 2% chance of the disorder, and whether a 98% chance of having a child without the disorder is inadequate for many adoptive parents is, I think, an important issue here. Would testing of adoptees, in fact, occur? Well, that lawsuit I told you about is one anecdotal piece of evidence, but this is the DeLisi and Burdish survey. Again, 100% of clinicians and 52% of the researchers she surveyed said that they thought adoption agencies should reveal a history of schizophrenia in a parent, and half the clinicians and almost 20% of the researchers said they should reveal a history of schizophrenia even in a cousin, where the rate of elevated risk, although there is an elevation, is relatively small compared to the general population risk. And obviously this is before we were envisioning having a panel of genes available. But note that in that study from last year, where 108 alleles were identified, one of the slides that Dr. Smolar showed you showed how you could aggregate the risk estimates for those variants and come up with risk categories. And if you could identify a child, even on the basis of common knowledge, as being in one of those elevated risk categories, you might well have a great deal of difficulty placing that child. I love this finding. This is back to the Danish sample. I told you about 19% of respondents said adoptive parents should be able to compel psychiatric genetic testing. And 22% said the prospective parents themselves should undergo psychiatric genetic testing before being allowed to adopt a child. So the spread of this notion is very difficult to contain once the idea is out there. Now let's shift to adults and ask what our attitudes should be with regard to testing for predisposition to psychiatric disorders in adults. The answer may depend on what we can do about it, if anything. Maybe also on the desire to avoid transmission of the alleles to children. But I think we're only going to know when the market comes into play. You all are aware that although there were very high rates of people at risk for Huntington's disease who responded in the early 1990s that if a test for a gene were available, they would have it. When the gene test became available, and to this day, the estimates are somewhere around 10 to 15% of people at risk for a completely penetrant, dominant condition are ever tested. And that suggests some considerable fear, at least in that context, of the negative impact of such knowledge, which may apply in psychiatry as well. You may want to know about your kid's predisposition. It may be something else to know about your own. On the other hand, there is at least some reason to wonder whether the situation may be different in psychiatry. So this is a study by Jason Schiffman and Lisa Dixon here. Jason is at the University of Maryland and a bunch of other people that was published last year in which they asked a sample of adolescents whether they would have genetic testing for a predisposition to schizophrenia if it could be shown that that predisposition interacted with the risk of using marijuana in terms of precipitating a psychotic episode or the onset of schizophrenia. And they had two different conditions. They said, what if genetic testing would show a 2% risk of schizophrenia? That's a doubling. Or what if it showed a 10% risk of schizophrenia? That's a tenfold increase. And what they found was that 20% of the adolescents said, I'd want to know what my risk is if it were a possibility of being doubled, whereas 43% said, I'd want to know what my risk is if there were a tenfold increase in risk. And they were also asked whether their use of marijuana would be altered if they tested positive. And interestingly, the responses were not sensitive to the degree of risk. So even if there were just a 2% risk, a doubling of risk, the same proportion of respondents said they would reduce or eliminate their marijuana use as in the 10% or tenfold increase condition. So an interesting study showing some sensitivity to risk with regard to testing, but maybe less with regard to the consequences of testing. Willem and colleagues in the British Journal of Psychiatry about 5 years ago published a study in which serotonin transporter genotyping had taken place. And then they went back to the participants and said, oh, by the way, we have the results. Would you like them? And they may tell you something, although in a limited way, about your propensity for depression. 66%, 2/3 of the participants said they wanted the results returned to them, and other studies are consistent in suggesting a high rate of desiring to know about genetic predispositions for psychiatric disorders, although usually in hypothetical circumstances. This was an actual circumstance. If they said yes, they got the data back. One major question, of course, here is what the impact of findings will be, positive findings, adverse findings, however you want to categorize them. I've told you about the insensitivity of likelihood of staying away from marijuana in the face of increased risk for schizophrenia. But in that Wilhelm study that I just described to you, subjects who had the SS genotype, the short allele on both chromosomes, which was the highest risk category in the Caspi et al. Study. Interestingly, if they were told that, they showed significantly higher levels of distress at 2 weeks and 3 months. So that's interesting in its own right. If you get bad news, you're more likely to respond adversely to it. It's also interesting because the putative mechanism here is an interaction between the short allele and environmental stress. So question, to what extent does telling somebody that they have the short allele constitute an environmental stress that in itself is likely to increase the risk for the disorder? Not something you usually have to worry about when you're dealing with other kinds of physical medical disorders, non-psychiatric medical disorders. We are, as a society now, struggling with this question of direct-to-consumer marketing of genetic tests. Many of you know that the FDA put its foot down when 23andMe appeared to be sending back test reports that had clinical implications. The FDA is beginning to move forward, although slowly and in a much more controlled fashion, in approving some direct-to-consumer testing. But there is concern about how well patients will be able to use this information. And what happens to the folks who get it? So this is the REVEAL study in Boston that Robert Green has been running for many years. And the data from that study, in which they tested folks for their predisposition to Alzheimer's disease based on the ApoE4 alleles that they carried, and gave the information back to them, the data from that study are usually cited as suggesting, not much impact. Folks did pretty well with that information. However, if you look carefully at their data, particularly this 2009 study that was in the New England Journal, what you see is that people who had pre-existing emotional problems had difficulties after getting the data back, and that makes sense. Folks who are anxious or depressed already may be more responsive to this kind of negative information. And in psychiatry in particular, that's something we need to be sensitive to in terms of weighing the risks and benefits of testing. Let me skip over that for the sake of time and go to this issue of premarital testing. Are there times when premarital testing would be appropriate? It goes on in some communities. What began as a Tay-Sachs registry in the Ashkenazi Jewish community has evolved into full-fledged programs for genetic testing in those communities. Kids are frequently tested in high school. There are drives in high schools to collect samples. And routine testing has expanded beyond Tay-Sachs to a dozen, or in some cases more, a dozen and a half different disorders that are routinely tested for. How well that information is used, or how it's used, is I think, variable. At the very least, couples can be alerted to the potential for genetic problems in offspring if they're both carriers for the same conditions. In some communities where marriages are arranged, marriages may not happen between incompatible men and women, at least genetically incompatible. Moreover, that DeLisi and Burditch study showed that 37.5% of family members of people with schizophrenia said they would not get married and they would not have children if they, quote, tested positive for schizophrenia. They were hypothesizing a single risk allele, but one could ask whether the results would be any different if what you had was a panel of alleles that could be aggregated to place people into the high-risk category. You heard Dr. Smoller briefly mention pharmacogenomics, and despite the fact that in some places in this country the use of pharmacogenomics in psychiatry is being touted, my understanding of the literature echoes what he told you, which is we haven't quite yet demonstrated that this actually has a positive impact on clinical outcome. But note the possibility that pharmacogenomic testing will tell us more than just am I particularly likely to respond to SSRIs. To the extent that we're looking at the serotonin transporter, it may tell us about our propensity for depression as well, our genetic propensity. And that's not a problem that's limited to psychiatry. For example, the rate of acetylation of exogenous substances in the liver, including drugs, which is why this is often in a pharmacogenomic panel, is also associated with the rate of environmentally induced cancers. So you think you're finding out one thing, but you're actually finding out about other vulnerabilities as well. And in neurology, we see that with Gaucher's and Parkinson's, people who do not have Gaucher's disease but are carriers, which would be uncovered in many of the typical Ashkenazi Jewish premarital preconception testing panels, turn out to be at elevated risk for Parkinson's disease for reasons that aren't yet clear. So you're fine on Gaucher's, but now in the back of your mind is that later in life you have to worry about being at increased risk for Parkinson's. Given the time, I'm going to simply mention that the question of whether insurers should be able to use genetic test results is a live one. Bob Klitzman and Wendy Chung and I had a little piece in JAMA last year exploring the potential uses and problems with the uses of genetic information in life insurance contexts. We have GINA, which precludes the use, or at least purports to preclude the use of genetic information, including family history, in health insurance situations, but it does not cover life, long-term care, disability, or any other kind of insurance, and the extent to which insurers will look to genetic information, particularly as it becomes more available in people's medical records, is an open question at this point. And neither GINA nor the Americans with Disabilities Act would preclude that. Finally, let me just note this last issue that we need to keep in the back of our minds. What do we do about family members if testing of patients themselves indicates that family members may be at risk for disorders? Now, this is much more likely to be an issue in conditions like familial polyposis or medullary cancer of the thyroid, which is a multiple endocrine neoplasia syndrome, which are autosomal dominant, but may also arise as we get stronger and stronger findings with regard to psychiatric disorders, and may arise already in the context of rare copy number variants that appear clearly to be associated with autism, schizophrenia, epilepsy, or other disorders as well, and what our responsibilities are. One court held that the physician had a responsibility to notify the family members. Another court in Florida held that the responsibility was only to warn the patient that they should warn the family members, but the physician didn't have an obligation to warn the family members directly. That's the entire body of case law out there. It's uncertain at this point how the majority of courts would come down on that. I'm going to skip the issue of uses in criminal justice and just move to summarize. Clearly, the nature of the genetics of psychiatric disorders, the fact that we're dealing with complex traits with, in general, polygenic influences, will limit the degree of some of these problems, at least until we get to the point where we can aggregate risk of individual alleles and come up with predictive equations. The fact that environmental influences play a major role in gene-environment interactions are likely to be important, and that may well, as you heard, be playing a role in the difficulty in identifying alleles linked to depression, will further modify the kinds of risks that are associated with simply knowing the genetic information per se. But as we get better at this, as we identify rare variants, as we identify and aggregate individual, more common allelic contributions, these dilemmas are going to come along. And we may want to start thinking them through at this point in preparation for what we seem to be on the verge of and that is the increasing introduction of precision medicine based on genomic advances in psychiatry. So let me stop there. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Paul. We have, tremendous excitement about new scientific advances and tremendous complexity in terms of how to apply them and what the ethical dilemmas are. We'd love to hear from you now. We have time for discussion, questions, comments for Dr. Smoller and Applebaum. Blair. Let me give you the microphone. Laura, can you help with this? Thank you. There was another microphone too floating around somewhere, but I don't know where it is. Okay.
Interesting talks. I guess there I go. I'll get the acronyms wrong, but I know that there's something like the American College of Genetics, Medicine, ACE, whatever it is.
And
I know that
American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics.
So they have this list of genes that they recommend that people be tested for. And I guess I was really interested in hearing, Paul, your comments on that, because that's now sometimes what's going into psychiatric protocols, right? Where you say, well, gee, we're not going to tell everybody everything we find, but maybe we'll follow this list and at least offer those things to people.
Right. So the ACMG came up with a position statement that said when genome sequencing is being done, particularly in research settings, that the researchers should, in addition to whatever else they were looking for, look at these 56 genes, mutations in these 56 genes, which are all highly associated with highly penetrant conditions that were, in their terms, actionable. There's something you can do about it. Long QT syndrome being an example, familial colon cancer syndromes being another example. And in their initial formulation, they said researchers should return these data to research subjects without asking them whether they wanted it or not, that they needed to know if they were carriers of one of these alleles. There was a lot of pushback. Some of the pushback came, for example, from folks who were doing cancer research with seriously ill cancer patients who said, you really want us to go to our pancreatic cancer patients who are, just trying to stay alive and tell them they, have a predisposition for long QT syndrome? What sense does that make? And what if people just don't want to know? Don't they have a right to that? So ACMG backed down a bit, and in a subsequent statement said that they changed their policy to say people could be allowed to opt out of receiving the information, although they recommended that this be done as an all or nothing. So either you opt in, you get it all, or you opt out and you get none of it, rather than being selective about it. There are a lot of people who have questions about, are those 56 genes? Originally it was 57, but I think the similarity to Heinz varieties just was too much to deal with, and somehow it became 56. But there are a lot of people who think that that's both an over-inclusive and under-inclusive list, and folks down at Baylor have a list that's over 100 now, and people are using different lists. But this is still, sort of actively in play, and something that we're dealing with here at Columbia as we roll out more genomic testing. The question of what are the obligations of researchers to look for and return, interpret what they find, and return to their research subjects, which involves a certain amount of counseling and assistance in follow-up, as opposed to simply focusing on the research question that they're asking and perhaps returning primary findings, but not going out and looking for these other things. And of course, the research community is very concerned that the more time and money they spend doing these auxiliary tasks, the less time and money they have for the study itself. So still in play, but that's sort of the ACMG piece of the story.
Yeah, is there any literature or interest in the genetics of criminal behavior of any sort?
Jordan may want to say something about this as well. Yes. There have been a number of genes, many of them associated with various neurotransmitter systems, particularly the dopamine and norepinephrine transmitter systems that have been in these sort of candidate gene-like studies associated with criminal or otherwise violent behavior. The degree to which these findings will be replicated, I think for many of them is in question. The best explored variant is an allele, a low productivity allele of the MAOA gene, monoamine oxidase A gene, which Caspi and colleagues in 2002 originally identified as demonstrating a gene-environment interaction with childhood maltreatment, showing elevated rates of antisocial behavior later in life. There have been multiple follow-up studies, the majority confirming the finding, some of them not confirming the finding, some of them demonstrating a finding even without the environmental influence. There are dueling meta-analyses out there. I would summarize to my reading by saying the majority of evidence seems to support the association right now, but it's by no means a slam dunk because there are certainly contradictory studies that exist and people are trying to look at the mechanisms. It seems to be an impulsivity-related allele in the sense that there have been some studies showing associations with pathological gambling, substance abuse, and other sorts of impulse control-related conditions. At very early stage, I would say, just the whole question of relationship to various kinds of criminality. Yeah, Jordan, you may want to say something about substance use. Just
Yeah, the substance use disorders are substance use disorders are known to be heritable, and there are some genome-wide association findings that are now emerging for those and for alcohol use. Actually, a couple of those emerged a while ago, but it's we still don't know too much about it. The tricky thing with the criminal behavior is that people often go from there is a genetic component, which I think that's not controversial to say there's a genetic component to everything behaviorally, to, so we should use this to predict whether or that it might exonerate or aggravate somebody's criminal justice case or something, where I think the weight of the evidence is pretty clear that even if that finding is true, it's going to be like one of many other potential risk factors you could point to for somebody's behavior, and the role of that is totally unclear, I think. I mean, Paul and I both carry the strongest genetic risk factor for violent crime, and that's seen in 90% of violent murderers, right? That nasty Y chromosome.
So this question's for Dr. Smoller. First of all, thanks for the talk. I wish I'd known how great it would be. I would have gotten all our pre and postdoctoral fellows from our Psychiatry program to come hear it. Um, I want to give you some impressions of what I took from it and see if you can check me on them. So one is that this is characterizing it from an epidemiological perspective. It's a sort of descriptive epi at this time. And one thing so moving from there, one thing I was wondering about is worrying about confounding for these associations, confounding by all the other genes that you don't know anything about. Is there attention to that? And the second thing is explanation. And so you just mentioned, male sex as a risk factor for violence. So you imagine the possibility that you took male sex characteristics and made an index out of them, and they would likely be strongly related to violence. So facial hair, hairy ears, stuff like that, and baldness. But they wouldn't explain the violence, but they'd be strongly related to it. Do we have to worry about that in the kinds of things that are being found so far?
I think that's an interesting question. I think from the epidemiologic standpoint, the genetic studies have a little bit of an advantage over other risk factor studies in that it's hard to confound, the genetic. It's hard to have a third factor that both influences the likelihood of the genetic risk factor. The genes come first, basically. So it's hard to have something that's causing both but is primary to the gene. So we do have a little bit of explanation built in the sense that a genetic association suggests a direct association. It's not necessarily causal because the genetic variant may be just correlated with one that that's nearby or something. The issue of the other issue you raised about all these other things that I think that's actually a really interesting issue, and I've been tempted to write something about the Y chromosome in that regard because it's an example of how a genetic risk factor. The reason there are many things about our gender that, and since at least genetic sex is genetically determined, that influence all kinds of behavioral things because of the way the environment responds to us. And so you could have a kind of genetic effect on outcomes that's really not because of the biology of the Y chromosome doing something, but it causes facial hair and certain physical characteristics and has a history in our culture and all those things that actually do have big outcomes on. So I think to that extent, it's true. You could imagine that something that has a phenotypic expression that then induces some kind of environmental response would make it even more complicated. It's not actually it's not causally related in the sense that you would want it to be mechanistically. There are also, it's related to the issue that we face in post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and other things where you have genes that influence not only the outcome disorder, but the behavior or other risk factors that may, or even environmental exposures that may lead to the disorder. So for example, not only is PTSD heritable moderately, but exposure to trauma is heritable. And so part of the way that certain genetic variation might confer risk to PTSD is by increasing the risk of exposure to trauma. So there are all these sort of complicated scenarios. Sorry. Yeah.
Are you done? No. My question's for Dr. Applebaum. I liked your talk a lot. I'm kind of interested in this ethical question about a duty to warn if you find out information about family members or something. So I'm thinking about other duties to warn, and it seems like generally, like with an STI or something, there's a duty to warn, and it's based on this sort of hidden premise that there's something we can do about it, that there's a preventative action. And I think especially in the case of psychiatric disorders, there's this worry about there not being any preventative measures. And then this additional factor that you spoke about a bit, which is that the distress caused by the information might actually do harm or might even interact with the gene. So I'm wondering what you think. Does that impact the question of the duty to warn? Do you think that makes sense as a...
So I don't think it's an accident that the two cases that have been litigated to date both deal with preventable, at least in principle, preventable disorders. So if you have familial polyposis, the cure for your cancer risk is to take out your colon, which is what people do. It's pretty dramatic, but that's what they do. It's, you know, it's better than dying, certainly, you know, from colon cancer when you're 32 years old, as happened in that case. Similarly, the multiple endocrine neoplasia syndrome, you can screen for and watch for, and certainly in a case where what's at issue is medullary carcinoma of the thyroid, as it was in that case, it's detectable. So again, it's preventable, or at least largely preventable. It is true that that may not be the case in psychiatric disorders. I think, you know, how far those cases get extended to include psychiatric disorders is just a completely open question at this point. On the other hand, you know, one of the frequent problems that we face in psychiatry is that when people begin experiencing problems, and schizophrenia is sort of the prototype of this, but it's not just schizophrenia, it takes them a long time, or someone a long time, to recognize that the problem that they're having is a psychiatric disorder, or the early onset of a psychiatric disorder, and to get them to treatment. So, you know, the DUP, the duration of untreated psychosis, in various countries around the world is a year, 2 years, sometimes more than that. And many people believe that that contributes to poorer outcomes in schizophrenia, and it certainly contributes to more morbidity. But the same may be true in anxiety disorders and depression, particularly when they start at a lower level and build up. So arguably, there may be some value in knowing about propensities to the extent that they trigger earlier diagnosis and intervention. So what constitutes actionability may not be limited to truly preventive interventions.
For Dr. Smoller, following up on Bruce's comment, you
This
mentioned
has to be the last question, okay?
I'm wondering if you're looking for genes for resilience, which may be involved. Is that being done, or how is that entering into the picture?
It is being done. People are beginning to do studies in which they're for example, taking polygene risk scores, taking scores that suggest a high genetic loading, but finding, this is actually not necessarily genes for resilience, although you could use it that way, but finding people who are not affected. What are the factors that mitigated that expression? Resilience is difficult to study because, like psychiatric disorders and everything else, it's really hard to define, and there isn't a lot of agreement, actually. Does resilience mean you don't get affected, or it means that you get affected but you bounce back? And those would be two totally different scenarios. But people are actually looking at, there's a whole area of behavior genetics, which we didn't really talk about, a view that there are genes that influence susceptibility to the environment, and that having one variant of this gene may make you an orchid or a dandelion, as it's sometimes described. So that is, people who may be like a dandelion, relatively unperturbed by the environment, but people who carry these differential susceptibility alleles may do poorly in stressful environments, but may actually do extremely well, better than the dandelions in positive environments, and that these are kinds of both risk and resilience genes. So there's a whole area of study of that. Not a lot has been published or really established in that area, but a lot of people are interested in it.
Thanks to both of our speakers and to everyone here. Thank you again. So we have a coffee break now. Let's reassemble at 10:40. Okay, welcome back. For the next part of our program, we're going to have actually an interview of a person who is personally affected by mental illness. We wanted to include the perspective of someone who may or may not have thought about these issues, but has been affected by mental illness himself. And so we're fortunate to have the participation of Michael Anderson, who is a volunteer with the National Alliance on Mental Illness in New York and a peer advocate for people living with mental illness. Mr. Anderson received his bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, from Georgetown University in International Relations and Spanish, and he's currently working towards an MSW at Hunter College. And he's living with a diagnosis of bipolar I disorder and PTSD. Mr. Anderson will be interviewed by Dr. Robert Klitzman. Dr. Klitzman is a professor of psychiatry and sociomedical sciences here at Columbia. He founded and directs the Masters of Bioethics program at Columbia University. And of course, he's written widely on ethical issues related to a range of topics, including genetics, reproductive technology, and HIV, among many others. He's published 8 books, and his most recent book is entitled The Ethics Police, The Struggle to Make Human Research Safe, which is about IRBs. So thank you. Michael and Bob, do you want to come up and take your positions here? I've set chairs for you, and the microphones are on the chairs.
Is it on now? Okay.
Hello.
So first of all, thank you so much. We're really enormously grateful to you to come and talk to us today. And thank you, Ruth, and the other organizers. And thank you all for coming. So just to start, I wonder if you can tell us just a little bit about your experience with mental illness.
Sure. So in 1997, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder 1 and PTSD. No, PTSD I was diagnosed in 2003. So I was doing fine in my 20s, and then at 26, the onset happened. I had a, basically, it wasn't overnight. I was experiencing what now I realize was mania and self-medication. And then in April of 1997, I had a full episode, a manic episode, followed by a depressive episode. They took me to a psychiatric hospital, and they diagnosed me there. And then I've been in treatment ever since, about 18 years.
Great. Well, thank you. So I'm wondering if you can tell us, how do you view the work that's being done to try to understand the role of genetics in mental illness and bipolar disorder, for instance?
Well, one thing is I do a lot of volunteering for NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And one major issue is the fact that, I don't know the exact statistic, but they're saying that people with mental illness often die about 25 years younger than the rest of the population. So it's a major issue as to treatment, and also with the community that I've been involved with, other people with mental health conditions. It's so hard sometimes to even know what your diagnosis is. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of, someone mentioned taking a lot of time to actually come up with the right diagnosis. So it's kind of a pressing issue in terms of life and death, really. So anything that helps advance that is a good thing, I think.
Okay. So suppose someone said, okay, well, we found a gene that has been associated with bipolar disorder, and we can offer this as a test. We can test your blood and see if you have these genes. Would you be interested in doing that?
I would personally, just because it's very interesting to me. In my diagnosis is kind of, well, it changed from just being bipolar 1 to bipolar 1 plus PTSD. But then my psychiatrist was kind of wondering if schizoaffective might be because of the delusions, the schizophrenic delusions that I was having. So it would be interesting just to see what a genetic test would say.
So if I understand, partly because it would help clarify the diagnosis, do you think it might affect treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one major of the 18 years that I've had treatment has varied so much. I've had private therapists, private psychiatrists. I've had Medicare, Medicaid therapists, clinic situations. And the treatment has varied so much over 18 years. I've had so many different uh, uh, experiences that I think that um, it's kind of like putting a puzzle together, and it would be great to have a genetic uh, diagnosis, but putting that together with the right treatment team might be an issue.
So suppose, let's say we found these genes and we found that you have these genes. What do you think your family would think, or how would they view that?
I think that it was a discussion right when I was diagnosed, because we have a second cousin living with bipolar disorder, and that was always an issue in the family. You know, when she had her episode back in the 70s, um, I believe she lost her child. Was separated from her child, so it was a very big discussion in the family. But she was really the only one. Um, so I don't know so much what people would say in terms of, we have a very, very uh, large family. We have a very tight knit family, like a very extended family. So I don't know personally. Nobody's ever mentioned it to me what they're thinking about in terms of their families. I know we have a lot of children in the extended family, and some of them show signs of ADHD or hyperactivity. And I wonder if we've never discussed it, but I wonder if they might think, if it, now that there's two examples in the family. But I think for me personally, I think it might affect family planning. I think I don't at this point plan to have a child, but if I did, I know that there's great treatment. I know that I'm in recovery, I'm in remission, I'm doing great, but it was a long road to get there, and I don't know if I would ever want to subject a child to that.
So suppose let's say we found a gene that's associated with bipolar and you had it. So do you think other people in your family, the younger people, for instance, would want to test, or those who might be, let's say, in their early 20s, where maybe they're thinking about the possibilities of having families?
Yeah, I think some would, and I think some would probably be adverse to that. But I think some would probably, because they've seen me go through so many um, really scary times. Because all the mania was very scary in the sense that I would just disappear. I would fly somewhere, deplete all my funds in an ATM machine and just take off and frighten, my family to the point where they had to go to the morgue, and it was just really horrible. And then the depressive side, the suicidal part, I mean, a lot of really scary stuff. And I could imagine that they would want to at least look into that.
So how about when you think, let's say we say, well, here are these terrible experiences you've had, the suicidal thoughts, the disappearing and everything. If someone said, well, we think that there are genes that may be explaining, at least partly, why that was the case, does that change how you look at yourself or what you did or those experiences?
Absolutely. Um, I have seen so much of, for me, at least in therapy, we've explored so much of the psychoanalysis, so much of the environmental aspect of things. It would be almost comforting in a way to kind of know that I didn't do anything. I know we talk about that a lot at NAMI, that it's the whole concept of the mother back in the 70s, and how they've come so far in terms of stigma, but there's so much stigma. I think one of the main issues is I haven't experienced it so well because I'm considered a high functioning person, but the whole violence in the media, and every time, something happens, and I get the feeling that, uh-oh, here I am very open about my diagnosis, but in the news it might be very different. So there's a lot of kind of stigma that might be mitigated by the fact that, oh, this is something you're born with. This is something that you had. It's not a choice. It's not, I think it would help. And also, I think in terms of insurance, it would help, because I know that there's been an issue with mental health parity, and it would just, it wouldn't be a question of the mind and insuring something that might be a little confusing, as opposed to just, all right, it's genetic and should be covered.
Now, there's some evidence that what may be the case is that there's a mixture of genes and environmental factors. Would that change any of that? If it's somewhat genetic, but not 100%, if it's part
Yeah.
and part?
Well, that's actually, I mean, I don't know anything about genetics, but that's kind of the way I approach everything. It's kind of, I feel, you know, you're born with genetics, and then you have I'm 44 years old, so a lot of environmental uh,
Stuff.
stuff. And I think that for me anyway, it's a mixture of both. So
How about, do you have a sense of people out there in the world, coworkers, if neighbors, other people, if they were to say, oh, this is, here's someone with bipolar disorder and they have a gene for bipolar disorder, do you think that would change how they look at the person?
yeah, I think it would be huge news. You know, I think it's so prevalent, it's so common, it's so in the news, it's so covered, and I think that yeah, I think it would be like some of the examples, Crohn's disease or whatever. It would just be like, oh, okay, and this is something that, you know, you have to get looked at, and there are predispositions and all that. And it would really completely change the illness, I think.
So it's a bit of a difficult question, perhaps, but so there are now technologies where if two people want to have a child, they can actually screen the embryos, and they could, for instance, if there's a gene for Huntington's disease, they could just use the embryos that don't have that gene. So say we could do that. Say we found genes associated with bipolar disorder, and we can screen embryos. Would that change? Would you want to do that? Do you think, if you want to have kids, do you think people should do that? Any thoughts on that?
Personally, no, I would not want to do that.
Why not?
I
Don't mind my asking.
Yeah. Honestly, I think my life would have been a lot different had my parents done that. If they were constantly worried from age 0, as opposed to, oh, wow, this happened at age 26, just like any other illness, diabetes, cancer, anything. It was an onset, and like, let's just deal with it. There are organizations like NAMI. We got help. I got into treatment. I was very lucky in my recovery and remission, and I just dealt with it that way. I think that someone mentioned kind of hovering over the child, worrying about stressors, and I just think it would have been very difficult. And if I were to be a parent, I think especially living with the illness, I think it would be much more difficult, because I'd be looking for any sign of anything. And I think that some of the symptoms are very difficult, because mania, you see a highly energetic situation. Is it manic? Even in my family now, if I am too overly enthusiastic or energetic, when I know, based on my own treatment team, that I'm fine, so I think it would just complicate things.
So suppose here's a family, here's an individual who just got diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and here's their family, and we have a test. What would you counsel either that person or their family about? Should they get tested or not?
I think the fact that counseling would be involved would be fantastic. I think putting the option out there is very important, and then weighing the pros and cons. But definitely putting the option out there. But I personally, if I were a clinician, wouldn't push either way. I would just put the information and the option out there, and I would also show how typical treatment might be. It depends where the family's coming from. If it's a socioeconomic situation and they're only getting treatment at a certain clinic that might not be able to provide what you might get, like now that I'm in private therapy and private psychiatry, I'm getting the full hour, with each, and it's just going very smoothly. But I think that it would really depend on the family. but I think the option would be important to put out there.
So you're concerned with, given that there are people who have better health insurance and less good health insurance, that people who have less good health insurance may not have a chance or be given the opportunity to really think through these issues as
Absolutely.
much.
Yes.
Those are good points. And how about out there, when you say you think doctors, clinicians shouldn't push it, why not? What do you think? If you were to advise clinicians, here's a room of doctors and there's this new genetic test and they're thinking of maybe offering it to patients, what would you advise the doctors or clinicians to do or not do?
I just think that, for me personally, I'm studying social work, and I try to see things as the person in the environment. I'm not a psychiatrist. I know very little about psychiatry. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physician. So that would be difficult right there. But I just think that certain decisions that might be made may be very helpful, but I think it needs to be followed through. I think that having the test is great, but it really needs to be followed through, because if parents opt to do that, that's fantastic, and it gives them knowledge, which is great. But now they're starting off, if they choose to have the child, or they're starting off with, they need lots of education. They need, at NAMI we offer education, advocacy, and support, and it would have to start right then, as opposed to, I think most they're talking about most onset is in the 20s typically. So I think that would have to be a whole, NAMI does work with, they call it basics. They work with children with these issues, but it would have to almost be a infancy, early education, advocacy, and support right away. And how to look for true indicators of the psychiatric illness and other things that you can let go, and how to not be overprotective. I think that's really an issue too. I'm very happy that I had these latent issues, but I had a normal childhood. I went through college. Getting my master's is now proving to be a more lengthy experience because of the concentration issues, but I got through undergraduate, and I'm seeing in the community that didn't happen for a lot of people. This onset happened right in the middle of schooling, and I think that's really an issue for a lot of people. So I think having that childhood, as long as possible, and having a normalcy is very important.
We have probably a few minutes. I'm not sure actually how much time we have. So I was going to open it up, or I can ask more questions, or would you mind if we opened it up? So let me just ask you before we stop. So just my question. So are there other thoughts you have about these issues that you think it's important for people to think about or be aware of?
I recently just read something about the GAP test. They take a swab from your mouth and can tell you what medication you're taking.
Right.
And given my experience and all the different medications I've been through, and the side effects and the years of trial and error, and when I was first taking antidepressants, and the whole idea of like 6 weeks on and then 6 weeks off and then 6 weeks on a new one, that would be fantastic. I mean, in the role of like for the patient, it would be fantastic to just know your diagnosis, know your meds right from the beginning, as opposed to an 18-year trial and error period, which is, it's what it takes. But I saw that recently, and I thought that would be, if it worked, that would be quick, and it would have literally taken 10, 15 years off the process.
So what there are now tests that can be ordered that look at psychopharmacogenomics. In other words, one could do a buccal swab and send it in as you would with 23andMe, and these companies say that they give information relating to the odds of particular medications working well or less well, or having side effects more or less based on one's metabolism and genes associated with metabolism. And also, one last thing is with NAMI. So, the issues of genetics within the community that you're part of and talk with people about, or do issues of genetics come up?
Not too much.
Okay.
I know that uh, the other organization, NARSAD, or maybe it's
Yes.
called Brain and Behavior Research. It's interesting because I follow them. I get their
Yep.
news too, but it seems very different. I think NAMI's all about education, advocacy, and support. It started, I believe, in 1979 by mothers who were concerned about their children, and so it was very focused on really just anti-stigma and educating the people dealing with it and the community, and advocating,
Right.
and then of course bringing all people with mental health conditions together. And so we have weekly meetings, and that's a form of empowerment too. And I think the genetics part comes up. They offer a course called Family to Family. They also offer a course called Peer to Peer. The peer to peer is for people living with mental health conditions, and the Family to Family is for the family members. And they're both 12-week courses, once a week, and there is a section in each curriculum binder that deals with the genetics, that deals with the biology.
Right. Well, your thoughts on this are really important and great. So thank you. So let's see if it's okay if we have questions. So the floor is open.
What's your sense about what people understand about the causes of mental illness or bipolar disorder? What do you think are, do you run into a lot of misconceptions or things that you think are either stigmatizing or just inaccurate?
With NAMI, I think at least with the Family to Family course, when everyone comes in, the main thing is these are biological brain disorders, and these are not your fault. This is not your fault. That's the most important thing. I think that comes from the fact that it was, blamed on the mother, or NAMI was started by mothers, and probably that was one of their concerns. But also, I think that many of the people wouldn't even come back to week 2 if that wasn't cleared up. So that's the main thing. But we also talk about the fact that there are environmental triggers. I think that is a little bit unclear as to what exactly that means. But I think the people that come to NAMI that I've seen so far are more concerned with coping than, and pretty much everyone that I've seen is in treatment and doing well, high functioning, and if not, just really interested in learning more.
Outside of NAMI, or if you meet people and for the first time, or just people in the world that you encounter, what do you think people's typical understanding is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the one misconception that I'm most concerned about is that we're violent. I think President Obama said, I don't know the statistic, but he said that you're more likely to be a victim of crime than a perpetrator if you're living with mental illness. And the statistics are something like 0.4% of those things you see on TV are actually done by mental illness. And I think that to me is the most disturbing, because the people that I know and the people that I associate with, though there is, in a manic state, and it can be very agitating, and it can lead to violence, and it can lead to certainly I've had 5 hospitalizations, and I was taken out in handcuffs, and I mean, it was violent episodes. But the fact that that's our natural state and our constant state, that's the one thing that I think is the misperception.
There's one more question. There's one more question.
Sorry, I keep talking. Michael, thanks so much for coming. I think it's really important that consumers are part of these discussions, and you offer a really articulate portrayal of your experience. And one thing you said that I thought was really interesting was, you said if you had this sort of genetic information that you had a high risk of bipolar 1, that you might find that comforting. And in my experience, interviewing people living with mental health conditions, they've said that a lot too. But then there's this other thing that comes out. So I think on the one side, this kind of genetic biological explanation can be really comforting and can provide explanation and can be sort of an excuse or reduce stigma, like you said. And then there's this other side that seems like a bit darker, which is that people sometimes deal with that kind of explanation as inducing a kind of helplessness, like, how am I supposed to have any control over this? And other people will rate that kind of explanation as suggesting people are going to be like this for their whole life. And so I feel like there's kind of this double-edged sword going on. Can you comment on that? Or
Sure. Thank you. Absolutely. When I was hospitalized the first time, first of all, I was very, very, very happy to be in the hospital because I was really, really embarrassing myself and embarrassing my family the night before with the things I was saying. And so when I was in the hospital, it was comforting just to be away and out of that acute situation. And when they gave me the diagnosis, for me, it was very comforting because it was the scariest thing I'd ever gone through in my life, to lose my mind. It was the most frightening thing I've ever experienced. And for my family, for everyone involved, it was very, very frightening. And to just know that, you know, this is something. And then in the hospital, they had all the different psychiatric disorders, all the information listed, all the books you could read, all the medications. So for me, that was very comforting. What wasn't comforting was when they said, you know, there is no cure and you will be taking certain medications for the rest of your life. That was disturbing. But like they say, if you liken it to diabetes or something, then it's just, that was kind of my thing, you know? But I didn't understand when you said that there is a darker.
I think you touched on it.
Okay.
The notion that it means that there may not be a cure, you can't just cut it out or something. But if you say, I think analogizing it to something diabetes
Yeah.
is helpful.
Yeah. Sure.
It was great. Thank you. Do I need this? Well, thank you, Michael. That was really terrific. Thank you. We really are so grateful to you. Was asked to talk about a few issues, and this follows from the conversation we just had, as well as from the presentations we had this morning. So I'm going to talk about Am I My Genes? Fate and Identity in the Age of Genetic Testing. And obviously, as we've been hearing, there are questions about how much of human behavior and psychiatric diagnoses are genetic. And I want to drill down and see what does that actually mean to people. And we began to just hear some of that just now. We've heard earlier what are the social, legal, ethical implications and how we should respond. And obviously, as we've also heard, there are combinations of multiple genes and environmental and other factors may be involved. But with this, and I want to focus on patients' experiences with these issues, there are a lot of uncertainties. There's the potential for misunderstandings, as Dr. Smoller just asked about, and there are fears of stigma and discrimination that could be involved. And we saw this slide earlier just showing that the cost of sequencing is going down, and that's led to the creation of big biobanks. Every major medical center in the country, as well as most drug companies, are trying to build big biobanks filled with our genome, so to speak. And as we heard also, there's a lot of misunderstandings out there, comments about the IQ gene, infidelity, it may be in our genes. British scientists find the FAT gene. This is from 2011. So there's still this what's called genetic essentialism, the notion that there is a FAT gene. There is and this has been in the literature over time, you know, someone I know, Peter Conrad at Brandeis, wrote a paper called Why Has the Gene for Alcoholism Been Discovered 8 Times? And he looked at the literature, and 8 times there were headlines in the New York Times, the gene for alcoholism is discovered, as we've been hearing. There's really been a shift in our understandings of this kind of genetic causality. The God gene, the gay gene. This is one of my favorite cartoons. I've got the fat bastard gene. And I think that the reason for this is complex, actually. And the Greeks believed that there were three fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. If you remember, one would make the yarn, one would measure, and one would cut it. And that would be the length of your life. And so there's, I would argue, a cultural notion that we have that we want to have prediction of the future. Every culture has soothsayers. In medieval literature, there are crystal balls. So we have this desire to know the future. We want to know what's going to happen, be it with the stock market or with our own lives. And so there's sort of a cultural narrative of now we're going to get the test that's going to show us. And I think what we're hearing is that we're now knowing or learning that the science isn't quite measuring up to that, but there's still this temptation to think that way. And there's also, of course, I think lingering behind this notions of human enhancement. I asked about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, but there are a lot of questions, and this is a growing market. And of course, eugenics is sort of looming behind some of this as we think about if we have genes for things that some people may see as socially desirable or not, is that going to lead to discrimination or worse? So wondering about these questions, I did a study, which is I interviewed with semi-structured interviews, individuals who have or are at risk for Huntington's disease, breast cancer, and alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which is a relatively rare genetic disease, but one for which there's a definitive treatment. So people actually get better if they get diagnosed with this. And obviously more common diseases like diabetes or depression or schizophrenia, as we've been hearing, are less likely to be associated with definitive genetic tests, and obviously other environmental factors may be involved. But I thought that understanding responses to existing genetic tests that have a clinical or personal actionability like these can help us in preparing for the future, both in psychiatry and the rest of medicine. So I thought I'd talk about some of the results. And I found that individuals who have or at risk of these diseases face a series of dilemmas. And they search for narratives and meaning. They try to make sense of this as best they can. They draw on previous beliefs. Personal views affect their decisions about testing, disclosure, treatment, reproductive choices, and other realms. So to give you an example, and this, again, I'm switching to medicine, but I think there are important implications here. The first woman I interviewed is a woman who had breast cancer and had the BRCA gene. And she said to me, you know, I always knew I shouldn't have stayed in that awful relationship all those years. And I said, why is that? And she said, well, that's why I have breast cancer. I said, yeah, but you have the breast cancer gene. She said, yeah. But what triggered it was the stress of that awful relationship, and I always told myself I shouldn't have stayed in that relationship, etc. The next woman I interviewed, also with breast cancer, the BRCA gene, said, you know, it was that awful job, that horrible boss. He was always stressing me out, and I was living on Long Island near the high tension wires. That's why I have breast cancer. Again, she said, yes, I have the gene, but this is what triggered it. The next woman I interviewed was an African-American woman from the South Bronx, and she said, you know, it's all the crap that they dump in the landfills in the Bronx where they would never dump in Manhattan where the rich people live. So I thought it was interesting because, of course, breast cancer, like psychiatric disorders, as we saw earlier, is undoubtedly a mix of both genetic and non-genetic environmental factors. So even if you have the breast cancer gene, there's about a 50% chance you'll get breast cancer. So there are other factors going on. And yet the things that people choose to look at or examine or emotionally feel are the cause or not can vary depending on a variety of situations. And I thought that it's therefore important to understand these issues because it can affect, it turns out, if you think that it's not really genetic, that's going to affect whether you decide to get genetic testing, whether you decide to get treatment, whether you decide to tell people in your family, et cetera, et cetera. So particularly when there are complex views of genetic and non-genetic, genetic tests to a certain degree can serve as a bit of a Rorschach test, that people can sort of view it in various ways. Some of you know I wrote a book called Am I My Genes? And that was one of the issues that came up in the book as the answer. So there are questions whether to test in the first place. And what's interesting, a lot of the literature looks at why you got tested. But what I found is even before people came in to be tested, people would say, well, you know, I knew I was at risk for Huntington's or breast cancer for a while. And my sister got tested, and then I waited a few years, and then my mother got diagnosed, and I finally decided to get tested. And then questions about why. There's notions of clinical actionability, and this came up in the question about ACMG's the American College of Medical Genetics decision to have a list of 56 genes. But for Huntington's, for instance, people would say to me, well, I didn't want to get tested. There's no treatment, but I want to know because if I know I have the gene for Huntington's, I'm not going to, live in suburbia and have a job I don't like and raise kids. I'm going to move to Tahiti and be an artist. And so there's personal actionability. And a few people said, well, my genetic counselor said, well, are you the type that does better knowing? And I don't really know what that means for this kind of information. This is different from, do I want to know, where I got into college or, something else. Obviously, there are fears of discrimination, and there's a lot of input from others. So what I found is that people who are debating questions of whether to get tested are talking to relatives or talking to other friends, people in genetic communities, or online, going to blogs of people with their illness, et cetera, et cetera. And genetic counseling experiences vary. They can be terrific. Sometimes the patients told me, the doctor wrote a slip, test for Huntington's disease, go get the test done, and that was it. So again, there's a lot of variability. And there's issues of disclosure. Whom do you tell? Some people would immediately tell immediate family members, but some said, my parents are in their 80s. If I tell them that I have this gene and I got it from them, they'll be upset. Why bother them? Some people said, with breast cancer in particular, I haven't talked to my sister in 15 years. She's XYZ. Expletive deleted. Why should I tell her? Questions of at what age to tell my offspring. So do I tell my, do I tell my 19 or 21-year-old daughter that that I have the breast cancer gene, that she may have it, that she may die of it? So you don't want to tell too early. On the other hand, there are people who said, it's not till I was married and about to have kids that my mother said, actually you may have Huntington's disease. Dad didn't just fall down the stairs. He actually had this disease. You may have it. Your kids may have it. And people say, why are you telling me this, Mom, now when I'm already married or about to get married, et cetera? So they're very difficult issues. And there are issues about long-lost relatives, I should say, which has gotten very little attention, I think. But people say, I wonder, I know my dad has these long-lost relatives in Texas somewhere. Should I email them and say, I found out I have this mutation? On the other hand, some people I interviewed said, I got this email from these relatives in Texas or California, wherever, that, I knew my father had some brothers down there, and they said, we have this weird mutation, alpha-1 something, and I got tested and I have it, and I'm on treatment. It's been great. So again, I think what happens is the fact that we may share genes with people to whom we're not socially close changes the moral calculus a bit, that we may have, or there are questions if we have moral obligations to people who we're genetically close to, even if we're not socially close to them, and there's a whole other set of issues. And then you plan telling, some people just blurt it out, et cetera. And then how much it tests family members. So partly because of insurance, people would say, my kids were always telling me, Mom, you have to get tested for breast cancer because, we want to know, but we don't want to be discriminated against. You've had breast cancer, or you're not going to be discriminated because you're, been at your company for 30 years, so you should be the one who gets tested. Or mothers saying to their daughters, look, you have to get tested for breast cancer. I had breast cancer. You really need to know. And the daughter says, Mom, leave me alone. I'm 24. I'm trying to start my life. I don't want to know this stuff. So again, families can be coercive in various ways that we as professionals can't be. And there's a lot of tensions that come out. And I think that as we begin to find genes associated and develop genetic tests associated with psychiatric illnesses, I think these issues may also come to bear. I think it's important that we be aware of them as clinicians. A lot of questions about why me. So people would say, yes, I know I have Huntington's because I have the mutation, but why do I have the mutation? Why did God give it to me? Why is it that my sister didn't get it and I got it, or vice versa? Am I doomed? Am I cursed? And what I found is that a few people who had had major trauma in their lives tended to feel, I always knew there was something wrong with me. People who had a history of depression, or one woman I interviewed had a history of having been abused, and she felt, I always thought I was doomed for something. And then the questions of chance and luck came up quite a bit. So with Huntington's, for instance, and part of this relates to misunderstandings of genetics, people would say, my sister tested positive for the Huntington's mutation. I felt terrible for her, but I felt so relieved because that means I'm not going to get it. Or conversely, they'd say, my sister tested and found she didn't have it, and I felt devastated because it means I'm going to get it. And some of these were scientists who knew statistics, knew that, in fact, each of these is an independent flip of the coin. But again, there is the way we emotionally experience causality, and then there's statistics, and they don't always intertwine as well as we think. Searches for a single cause. I felt that a lot of people in the end needed to decide one way or the other. It's genetic, it's not my fault, or, it's what they do in what the landfills in the Bronx or whatever it is. And it's very hard to sort of have two notions at the same time. And there was the English poet John Keats who famously talked about negative capability, that he said, to write poetry, you have to be able to have two conflicting notions in your mind at the same time. And it's very hard to do that. And I think that that plays a role here. And people wrestled with issues of punishment and said, I know it's not, or I don't want to blame my mother, but I kind of do. That it makes no sense to say that. And kids and parents would say, I'm afraid my kids will blame me that I gave them this gene. So we again have sort of a psychological apparatus for dealing with blame that sort of maps on not well to the facts of genetics and disease. Political beliefs. One woman said, I'm such a big environmentalist. I want to say cancer is caused by pollution. Now I find I have the breast cancer gene. How do I put this together? So again, at a micro level, I think a lot of people may end up struggling with these kinds of issues. And people engage in what I call personal epidemiology. So one woman said, I'm from New Orleans. Everyone I know in New Orleans has cancer, so it must be something in the water. So again, people are trying to make sense of who in their family has diseases or not. Another woman I interviewed was of Asian descent, and she said, I'm the one with breast cancer, so it must, and my family back in her Asian country don't have it, so it must be environmental. So again, people are trying to make sense of the cause and how to combine these things, and I think particularly when we find disorders, as in psychiatry, that are mixtures of environment and genetics, people I think will make sense of this in various ways based on their other needs, views, etc. It may not be the way we look at it. Again, people want to avoid self-blame, notions of luck. Luck came up a lot, actually. I'm lucky I didn't get it, or I'm unlucky I got it. And so I thought it was interesting. So I actually did a Medline search of luck. So if you do a Medline search of luck, you'll get hundreds of hits. There are hundreds of articles in the past few years that mention luck. None of them I found. I looked at about 100. None of them define it. And luck, actually, there's an interesting literature in the anthropology literature, the psychological literature, the philosophical literature that each look at them quite differently. So for the philosophical literature, if you're unlucky or lucky, refers to whether you have responsibility for what happened. If you're in the psychological literature, it's more, do you blame someone or not, right? If I'm unlucky, I'm to blame, or I'm not to blame. Rather, if it's luck, I'm not to blame. If I'm et cetera, et cetera. And in the anthropological literature, it's much about sort of having a system of explanation. But anyway, it's an interesting notion. And then how to see oneself. So people said, I wonder, am I sick? Am I predisposed? Here I have this mutation. I'm not yet sick. And what does that mean to be predisposed? I'm neither here nor there. Right, and there's been in literature people talking about sort of, I think, pre-patience is the term, but again, it's unclear what that means in one's sense of self, and we know that we all have a sense of ourselves that we construct or come up with, and the question is, how does genetic information as we find it, how is that going to map into one's sense of self? And I think there's a variety of ways, and we need to be sensitive to this in our patients because I think it's going to affect what they decide to do in terms of testing, treatment, et cetera. There are misunderstandings, as I mentioned, about coin tosses being independent, about Mendelian genetics. Someone said, well, lightning doesn't strike twice. I have this gene, so that means that's what I'll die of. I'm not going to get anything else, so I don't have to worry about other things, et cetera. And there's the media often promoting, I think, misunderstandings of genetics as well. And I think we even saw earlier, I think, with each discovery, there's often hype, and we read articles in the newspaper, and they're careful. They say, promising new results suggest, gene for XYZ discovered. Can, look, we're on the path to treatment as a result. So again, funding's important for this. We need to get funding. We need to suggest that we're going to have answers, but I think that can get in the way of our understandings and our patients' understandings of these conditions. Healthcare decisions, is it going to motivate adherence? As we heard earlier, there could be a double-edged sword sometimes. We hope patients use the information for the good, but it can be used for discrimination, et cetera. And then reproductive choices. I actually was surprised when I started to interview people for Huntington's, at risk of Huntington's. I thought I would hear about issues of privacy a lot and discrimination. And again, people said, well, the major issue I face is, should I have kids? Should I adopt? Should I abort? Should I screen embryos? What do I do? And so I have since then, as some of you may know, started to look at issues of reproductive technologies and use of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Some people, and there are major questions. Should we offer, if we, let's say we now offer, we screen embryos for Huntington's. We have non-disclosing PGD, in which the parents are not told whether or not any embryos are found that have the Huntington's gene. In other words, the parents don't know if they have it. They just want to make sure their kids don't have it. Often, it turns out about 75% of cases, I understand it, turns out they do find genes with embryos with HD, and it's usually quite obvious that the parent has HD. They are showing symptoms, and they say, well, I don't know if I have it, but I just want to make sure my kids don't. And yet that raises questions for many clinicians. Do we want to help parents who have a terrible disease, quote unquote, have kids? What is the role of the physician in being involved in that? Should we care about how good a parent the parent will be? Again, complicated issues. There's also a large market for buying and selling human eggs. Often people decide, I have a risk of depression in my family or schizophrenia, so let's buy someone else's sperm or egg. And again, if you look, there are many websites. This is eggdonor.com. But if you look, popular searches, Caucasian, Chinese egg donors, Hispanic, at the bottom, Jewish, Islamic, Mediterranean. This is another one. This is egg-donors.com. There are drop-down menus. You choose height, race, weight, skin, eyes, hair, etc. You pay more if you want more genetic information, more medical history, for instance. There are questions, as we heard earlier, with sperm donors as well. What if the information is incorrect? Who's responsible, etc. But again, I think this raises a number of questions. I've had someone I know as a friend said, well, we're going to get an egg donor, but she's a history of depression in her family. Should we not? Do you think we should not use her as an egg donor? So again, there's questions how we process this. And as we have, as soon as there are tests that are strongly found to be associated with mental illness, I think that there may be drop-down menus here. Do you want to pay the extra $100 for your egg donor and make sure they don't have genes associated with schizophrenia, depression, et cetera? And again, this is blondes, brunettes is another site. So there's also a question of privacy and insurance. So as we heard earlier, as Dr. Applebaum said, there's the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which protects health insurance, but not disability insurance, life insurance, long-term care insurance. But people are also quite wary about just trusting the laws, especially with electronic medical records. So if we begin to find genes, if we do whole genome testing, and we find genes associated with, say, autism or schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder, should they be in the electronic medical record? Should they not be there? As we do whole genome testing, we're of course going to find genes associated not just with psychiatric disorders, but with other disorders. Should all of that be in the medical record? None of it? Some of it? Which should be? Who should decide? Et cetera, et cetera. Some people said they want to clean up their medical record. Whether to use insurance. Some people say, well, I know that there's not supposed to be any discrimination. I don't trust it. I'm going to get tested. I'm going to pay on the outside under a pseudonym because I just don't want anything there. Some say, patients have told me, I told my doctor, and there are support groups for certain illnesses that encourage us, tell your doctor you don't want this in the medical record, that you're going to get tested. You got tested. Here's the result. I don't want it in the medical record. And of course, that raises certain conflicts for the physician because the medical record is supposed to be accurate. If there is medically relevant information in some way that's not in the medical record, it could potentially interfere with one's treatment. And then there's subtle discrimination I found. So one woman I interviewed said, I tested for the breast cancer mutation. I mentioned this to, and I found I had it. I mentioned this to my coworker I share a little cubicle with. The next thing I know, people came up to me in the hall and said, how are you? I said, fine, thank you. But then everyone assumed when the head of my division retired that I would be promoted and become head of the division. The head of the division retired and I was not promoted. And I can't prove it, but I think it was discrimination. I think that they didn't fire me, but they didn't promote me. And other people have said, when I did a study of when doctors become patients, and I heard a lot about subtle discrimination there too, that doctors, when they became sick, often were suddenly no longer referred patients. They were no longer asked to be on grants, no longer asked to be on papers. I think the notion of subtle discrimination is an important one and can influence what goes on in ways that we need to be more aware of and has not really gotten much attention. And of course, there's been civil rights legislation for over 50 years, or 50 years last year, right, against racial discrimination. And unfortunately, as we all know, discrimination still goes on. And then there's disclosing in the wired world. So do you tell your bosses, your coworkers? Many of us have work friends, and people debated this, even with dating, for instance. People would say, well, do I tell someone on a date, the first date, gee, I have this mutation and it, I may get it and kill my father and it may kill our kids. Do I not say it? Do I wait until we've been dating for several months and they feel, well, why didn't you tell me this earlier? So again, this is very loaded information that other people may or may not understand, and not only at the level of healthcare policy, but at the level of our relationships at work with friends, et cetera, it can have important implications. And then there are genetic communities, I think, are playing more and more of a role in how people understand this. They can be enormously helpful in helping people cope with illness. They may expose people to questions they're not ready to deal with. There may be accurate and inaccurate information out there, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there are going to be increasing questions for providers. Even now, we heard about the tests for pharmacogenomics. There are tests that are being marketed that, quote, predict suicidality. The FDA called me about 9 months ago that there was a test that a company was about to release, a genetic test to predict suicidality. They asked me what I thought. I looked at the paper. I thought it was junk science, but the FDA is powerless to do anything. As some of you may know, this is a big area of debate. But should we order tests for which patients, how to discuss it with patients, how to convey the uncertainties involved? Patients may increasingly ask doctors, as we just heard, I heard there's this test out there for either for drug response or for bipolar disorder. I read there's a new test for schizophrenia. Should I take it or not? And this is a study that I did with Dr. Applebaum and Wendy Chung and others, and I apologize for the small size here. But we asked a psychiatrist, to the best of your understanding, is there a genetic test available for Alzheimer's, autism, borderline personality disorder, intelligence, major depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, et cetera, et cetera? And then here, halfway down, in the future, will genetic tests have a role in diagnosing all these various disorders? And people were very split, and there were gender differences. So borderline let's take major depression. 19% of psychiatrists thought there was a test for major depression. Obsessive compulsive disorder, 10%, schizophrenia, 25%, et cetera. And then in the future, do you think genetic testing will have a role in diagnosing bipolar disorder? 80% said yes. Have a role in diagnosing schizophrenia? 80% said yes. So psychiatrists, even though the science may not be there, for good or bad, it's good that we prepare people, but people may mistakenly think there are tests there already. And again, this is all published. I'm happy to give you the reference. Just Google it. But these are psychiatrists' understanding of genetic contribution to psychiatric disorders. So we asked the extent of genetic contributions to all these disorders: anorexia, antisocial personality disorder, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, creativity, et cetera, homosexuality. And what struck me is there was a difference between men and women. The women were more, and the choices were unsure, moderately high, or none, or very low in terms of contribution. And invariably, the women said, I don't know. So the men either had said high or low. There was variation on all of these across the board, but the significant finding was not whether between gender, not whether it was high or low, but the women were more likely to say, I just don't know, and the men felt whether it's high or low, they knew. I mentioned this to a friend who said, well, it's like with driving, that the man always feel the stereotype. The man knows where to go, even if he says he knows the directions, even if he doesn't. But anyway, so there may be differences in how psychiatrists understand these issues and talk to them about patients. So obviously there are questions for patients, whether to undergo genetic testing. As we heard earlier, it could be from physicians, or there may be direct-to-consumer marketing of genetic tests. And even though the FDA shut down the ability of, as we heard, of 23andMe to claim medical benefit for its tests, I think tests will be back directly marketed. Questions about perceived benefits, responses, et cetera. I think there are a lot of implications for professional education, public education, policy, as we've talked about, and research. Again, use of tests by these various groups, schools, employers, insurance companies are all up for grabs. It's the book, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you very much.
Actually, our plan is to wait
Oh.
until the next talk and
Okay.
take questions then. Key is going to help with the transition, and while he's doing that, I will introduce, with great pleasure, our last speaker, Bruce Link. Dr. Link is professor of epidemiology and socio-medical sciences in psychiatry at the Mailman School of Public Health, and also research scientist at New York State Psychiatric Institute. He is recognized throughout the world for his groundbreaking work on the connection between socioeconomic status and health, homelessness, violence, stigma, and discrimination. And he's going to speak to us about genetics and the stigma of mental illness. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thanks for the introduction. I have to admit that I'm a pinch hitter today. I'll be talking mainly about my wife's work today. But pinch hitter or not, the umpire says batter up, and so here I am. I'll do my best. To begin, I'll just say what I think about when I think about stigma. And we've written about this, and we think about it as an overarching concept that includes the interrelationship between multiple components. The plugging out of characteristics, categorizing them, labeling them, the linking of those characteristics to unwarranted stereotypes like dangerousness and mental illness, a downward placement in terms of status, a little less than, a little less worthy than, and then finally discrimination. And that stigma exists when those things co-occur. And so it's this umbrella concept. Now going forward from that, I'll tell you what it is that I want to present to you today. Evidence about genetic attributions and mental illness stigma. I'm going to talk about population trends and individual level studies addressing that issue. Then I want to talk about the social consequences of genetic explanations for racial differences in health, and with the subtitle, A Backdoor to Eugenics. So starting with the population trends and genetic attributions and mental illness stigma, the claim is that more education about genetic causes results in less stigma. This is the claim we'll evaluate. Major effort has been made over the past 6 decades to move mental health conditions away from being viewed as social deviants to an illness model. If people can just see that mental illnesses are illnesses like other illnesses, not individual failings, but illnesses with biological and genetic basis, and that they're amenable to treatment by professionally trained persons, then stigma will be reduced. So to evaluate that, I'm going to tell you about studies that we did in 1996 and 2006 in conjunction with the General Social Survey. 2 national representative samples of over 1,400 people living in households in the United States. And they're in-person interviews. We did it a collaboration between Columbia and Indiana University. Bernice Pascal-Salido and myself there were involved. And we gave people vignettes, 4 vignettes, 3 describing mental disorders, schizophrenia, alcohol dependence, and major depressive disorder, and 1 that doesn't meet criteria, just a troubled person, for example. And we randomly assigned 1 of those to each of the subjects in the study. And we asked them all sorts of questions about that. And here are about those vignettes described. And our findings were that a belief in genetic and biological causes increased dramatically. So the message that was trying to be delivered was received. People thought that genes were more involved in causing the disorders we described to them in 2006 than in 1996. People were more likely to recommend medical and psychiatric treatments, but the core stereotypes that we also measured, of whether the people were competent, whether or not they were dangerous, whether or not people would be willing to interact with them, social distance, didn't change at all. So at this big population level, we see changes in the attributions of the causes of mental illness, but no change in core stigma. So it's not working at the big population level. So here's something about experimental studies. And there's Jo Phelan, my wife, who led these studies. So I'm going to tell you about one of her studies, and then a literature review we did of the impact of genetic attribution. So hers is kind of like an example of the kind of study, actually I think a better than average one,
But I'll tell you about that first, and then I'll tell you what all of the literature that we found said about this issue. So it's a survey experiment. It's a telephone survey, 1,416 people, nationally represented. We oversampled to get ethnic groups so we could look within ethnic groups. But we randomly assign genetic versus non-genetic attributions of cause in vignettes depicting major depressive disorder and schizophrenia. That's the setup. And this is how we manipulate in the vignette experiment the attribution of genetic cause. Now let me tell you something about what caused Anne's problem. When she was being treated at the hospital, an expert in genetics said that Anne's problem was strongly genetic due to genetic factors. In other words, her problems had a very strong genetic or hereditary component. And then partly genetic, and then not at all genetic. Not due to genetic factors or hereditary factors. Her problem was definitely not genetic. And pretty much the people believed this when we told them that these were the cause. We asked them about that. And so when you do this, there's two, and we talked about this just a little while ago, there's two possibilities. There are good things that could happen and maybe bad things that could happen. So one set of good things that might happen come from we can think about them from the lens of something called attribution theory. And it's a kind of common sense idea. If a person lacks control over the cause of his or her stigmatized characteristics, others will respond with, I'm not going to blame that person as much. I'm not going to be as angry. They didn't do it themselves. I might have more pity for them. I might not punish them as severely for things that they might have done, and it might increase my helping. So in those genetic attributions to lead to these positive outcomes. But as someone said, the two-edged sword is the idea of genetic essentialism. So genes is the basis of human and individual identity. DNA is what makes us human. So we sort of are our genes. You've heard that a couple times today. Already. So if that's true, it's inside the person, it's kind of like stuck in there. So you're going to be fundamentally different because you're genetically different, and genetic essentialism says we are our genes. The stigmatized characteristic is firmly attached to the individual. The problem should be persistent, serious, and maybe incurable. It's just there all the time. Problem likely to occur in family members and then might increase social distance from a stigmatized person and biological relatives, especially if you're in kinds of relationships that might involve the sharing of genes. So here's what we found from our experiment. So the attribution theory things are on the left-hand side. Did it increase blame? Did it decrease blame, increase sympathy, and so on? No significant effects except for punishment. Less likely to punish if the attribution was to a genetic cause. And then the genetic essentialists, you'll see that core aspects of stigma didn't change really, the differentness, which you might think would, and social distance towards the person themselves didn't. But these other aspects, how serious it is, it's more serious if it's described as being genetically caused. It's more persistent. It's less treatable. It's the risk to the child, the risk to sibling of passing it on or having it be associated. And then respondents wanted to have more social distance from the sibling, especially in intimate characteristics, intimate relationships. So that's an example of one of the studies. Now, what do we find from all of the studies? We examined 25 studies on the association between genetic causal attributions and stigma outcomes. So for the stigmatized characteristics were in these were mainly mental illness, mainly schizophrenia and major depression, but also things like stuttering, obesity, and so on. And then the designs, 13 of them were experimental, like Joe Phelan's study, and 12 of them were non-experimental. And here's what the results showed with respect to core stigma outcomes, so like social distance. So 7 of the studies, significantly higher social distance, 4 significantly lower social distance, and 12 no effect at all. So kind of like who knows where it went. Fear, dangerousness, and unpredictability, we think about those as stereotypes associated. 5 significantly higher for fear and dangerousness or unpredictability, and 4 no significant difference. So then those are the core stigma ones, and kind of bounces around, you can't make too strong a conclusion either way. Here are the results with respect to the attribution theory outcomes and the genetic essential outcomes. So with attribution theory, 4 significant associations are consistent with attribution theory, reducing blame, anger, and punishment, and increasing pity and helping, and 9 associations not significant. And then with respect to the essentialism, 4 significant associations consistent with genetic essentialism, and 2 associations were not significant. And all 4 of the associative stigma, that is, wanting to keep social distance from a sibling, were consistent with genetic essentialism. So that can lead us to some kinds of conclusions about the evidence. So results are consistent with the idea that genetic attributions have simultaneous positive and negative effects on stigma via attribution theory on the one hand and genetic essentialism kinds of things on the other. We saw beneficial effects for attribution theory outcomes, if there were any effects, and harmful effects for genetic essentialism results. And again, consistent with the idea that genetic attributions have circumcised, the evidence is consistent with the idea that genetic attributions have circumcised rather than global effects on stigma. And genetic attributions may not importantly affect major stigma outcomes in a consistent way, like social distance and negative stereotypes. The major risk that we conclude from this investigation is to the biological relatives. So that's that. And now I want to turn to another thing where I think is even more important for us to engage. I mean, that's super important, but this one has really got me like fired up. It has to do with the effects of how we study genetics in health studies and whether it might contribute to the perpetuation of racism. So we've seen slides about the Human Genome Project, and I probably don't have to repeat these. People say it's really important. It has intended consequences and unintended consequences. The question for us is that whether the geneticization has an effect on racism, in particular on the belief in essential differences between blacks and whites. That's what we're going to investigate. And why is differences between blacks and whites important for racism? Here's a definition of racism. Racism is the belief that race is a primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. You'll notice in that definition that racial differences are central. That's what we're going to be studying. Other social science definitions of racism are consistent with that differences, fundamental differences between the races are part of racism. So why might the genetic revolution change beliefs in racial differences? Well, because the genetic revolution has probably increased genetic essentialism. Genes are the essence of our human and individual identity. We are our genes. DNA is what makes us human, Watson said. Genes are a vital part of who you are, Morley Safer said. And then we all say it. It's in our genes. It's in their DNA. That's why they're doing what they're doing. So the bearing of genetic essentialism on beliefs in racial differences. So to the extent that genes of blacks and whites are the same, blacks and whites are the same, if we're thinking genetic essentially. To the extent that the genes of blacks and whites are different, blacks and whites are essentially different. So what messages have emerged about this issue with the development of the human genome research? So here's from Clinton. I believe that one of the great truths to emerge from this triumphant expedition inside the human genome is that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, they were worried about it, they put in race there, are more than 99% the same. What that means is that modern science has confirmed what we first learned from ancient faiths. The most important fact of life on this earth is our common humanity. And then Craig Venter said the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. However, attention has increasingly turned to that 0.1% of the human genome that varies between humans. Research has increasingly looked to racial differences as the basis for variation in that small proportion of the human genome. A major direction of this research is the search for genomic bases of differences in disease outcomes between racial groups, lung cancer, breast cancer, and so on. So the idea we're going to test comes from this man, very famous sociologist. He was president of the American Sociological Association. His name is Troy Duster. He wrote that book, Backdoor to Eugenics. I'm going to develop his idea. And his idea is that articles that are presented to the public that are like this one, so through the news media, are going to initiate this backdoor to eugenics. So here it is, and it's going to be one that we're going to give to people, and we call it the backdoor vignette. It's going to be involved in our experiment about this. Doctors have long known that African Americans are prone to heart attacks. In fact, their heart attacks are more likely to be fatal compared to Caucasians. A recent study suggests that genetics may help explain this racial difference. Dr. Bruce Furman and other geneticists at Columbia University detected a version of a gene that raises the risk of heart attack in African Americans by more than 250%. All of this is taken from real news reports. Dr. Furman said that the gene they identified is much more strongly associated with heart attack in African Americans than in Caucasians. These findings, said Dr. Furman, offer strong evidence that genetic factors are important in explaining the higher rates of heart attack in African Americans. So how does this lead to the backdoor to eugenics idea? So such reports may seem far removed from genetic essentialism or racism, but are they? They communicate with the authority of science and medicine that race is a valid and useful way of categorizing human beings. It's unlikely the public will restrict their conclusions to genetic disorders. They will ask, if genetic disorders are differentially distributed by race and ethnicity, why aren't other human traits and characteristics? Quote from Duster. So acceptance and generalization of messages are facilitated by the manner in which they are communicated, objective, apolitical, non-ideological. In this way, eugenics comes through the back door. We don't really like the word eugenics, but that's the word he used, and you'll see exactly what we mean by it going forward. So the basic research question is, will increased reports of differences between racial groups and genetic aspects of disease lead to increased beliefs in genetic essential differences, in essential racial differences? So if this backdoor to eugenics hypothesis is true, these things must also be true. The genetic revolution increases the public exposure to statements indicating that racial groups differ in terms of genetic disorders. And second, the public responds to these statements with an increased belief that racial groups differ more fundamentally in ways that go beyond health. No evidence about either one of those. So Joe wrote a grant, and this is the research team. It was funded by ELSI. And the research strategy is multi-method. Has the public been increasingly exposed to news stories about race, genomics, and health as the genomics revolution has progressed? That must be true. Are such stories presented in a socially and ideologically neutral manner? So to test that, we're going to do a content analysis of newspaper articles about race and genomics from 1985 to 2008. And second, if members of the public are exposed to such stories, do they respond with a heightened belief in fundamental racial differences? And we're going to do a survey experiment assessing the impact of different versions of mock newspaper articles, one of which I read to you, about race and genomics on beliefs in fundamental racial differences in population-based samples of Americans. So the hypotheses for the content analysis are that the number of articles that discuss race and genomics and health increased significantly between 1985 and 2008, and that the number that resemble that backdoor vignette that I read to you also increased significantly, that people are getting exposed to this stuff. Articles that discuss health-related differences are less likely to discuss racism or other ethical concerns than articles that do not discuss health-related differences. And articles that discuss health-related differences are more likely to endorse genetic causes than articles that do not discuss health-related differences. So we searched the Nexus, got a bunch of articles. We did inter-rater reliability, whether it should be included in our review, and that was pretty good. And we looked at 189 articles. And the article, these are the measures we use. The article discussed genetic causes of health and racial differences. So that difference, we were able to rate that with two coders rating each one independently. The resemblance of the article to the backdoor vignette, did it look like that one I read to you? Whether or not the article endorsed genetic causes, we rated. Whether or not it mentioned anything about racism, prejudice, or similar concepts in the article. We can compare health and non-health on these things. And then whether they discussed ethical concerns such as discrimination, prejudice, stereotyping, or eugenics. Those are the ratings we're able to do. And here's the results about the number. So the early ones, it's pretty flat and not very many. It goes bouncing up and down, and there are reasons for why it goes bouncing up and down. Somebody said something stupid about race, and the papers covered it a lot, race and genetics, and the papers covered it a lot. But the general trend is up. People are getting exposed to these more. Both total number of articles have gone up. Ones that represent the backdoor vignette have gone up over time. So that part is tested with that picture. Then we go through each one of these and look at the health versus the non-health. So if dimensions of racism, what if it's not about health? Much higher, significantly higher than if it's about health. Racism, ethical concern, if it's not about health, much more likely to raise ethical concerns in the article. Endorsement of a genetic cause, much more likely in the health articles than the non-health articles. So conclusions so far. First, the first necessary component for the backdoor to eugenics is present. Increasing the number of relevant articles, messages presented in a positive and objective manner without mention of controversy or social issues. So now, for the second part of it. So from the content analysis, we identified 3 types of articles, one representing the type of message central to the backdoor to genetics hypothesis, the backdoor vignette, and 2 strategically selected points of comparison. Created mock articles, modeled closely after actual articles, and modified to standardize the length, the prestige of the sources, the cited in the articles, and to lower the reading level. And then we randomly assign one mock article or no article to each participant. To assess the impact of the article on belief in essential racial differences. So that's what one of them looked like when it popped up on the screen of the people responding, our nationally represented sample responding to it, the article. So it looked a little bit like an article. And then we're going to have these 3, which I'm going to show you, vignettes. And then we also had one where we gave them no vignette at all, just to be sure that there wasn't something just about talking about giving them a vignette that so here's one of the strategic comparisons, the social construction vignette. Most people would agree that it's easy to tell at a glance if a person's Caucasian, African, or Asian, but a recent study suggests that it's not so easy to make these distinctions when one probes beneath the surface characteristic and looks for DNA markers of race. Analyzing the genes of people from around the world, the researchers found that people in the sample were 99% the same at the DNA level. That means that the percentage of genes that vary among humans is around 0.01% or 1 in 10,000. This is a tiny fraction of our genetic makeup as humans, noted Dr. Furman. The researchers also found that there is more genetic variation within each racial or ethnic group than there is between the average genomes of different racial or ethnic groups. And you can see we have other stuff there. I'm just giving you the essentials. Traits like intelligence, artistic talent, and social skills are likely to be shaped by thousands, if not tens of thousands, of genes all working together in complex ways. For this reason, these traits cannot respond quickly to different environmental pressures in different parts of the world. This is why the differences that we see in skin color do not translate into widespread biological differences that are unique to groups, and why Dr. Furman says the standard labels used to distinguish people by race have little or no biological meaning. That's the social construction vignette. The genetic reality vignette, which also you see in the news, most people would agree it is easy to tell at a glance if a person's Caucasian, African American, or Asian. A recent study suggests that the same racial groups we can identify do in fact correspond with broad genetic differences between groups. Dr. Furman says that racial difference exists because early humans in Africa spread throughout the world 40,000 years ago, resulting in geographical barriers that prevented interbreeding. Oops. You sort of get the idea here. A sense, and I'll read the last one. Hence, Dr. Furman says, race matches the branches of the human family tree as described by geneticists. So that's the racial differences are real vignette. So in contrast to the backdoor vignette, the comparison vignettes emphasize broad rather than specific racial differences, thus should be more likely than the backdoor vignette to affect endorsement of essential racial differences, except for the possibility of the backdoor to eugenic effects. Specific effects about health that generalize to other attributes, and the comparison vignettes are more recognizable as conservative or liberal. So you're not likely to be thinking, oh, that's a conservative statement or a liberal statement when you're reading the backdoor vignette. So some of the ways that the backdoor vignette is different. We debriefed people to let them know that these were concocted articles and people had different views. Here's the dependent variable. I'll just give you a couple of these, you'll get the idea. Although black and white people may be alike in many ways, there is something about black people that is fundamentally different from white people. And then reverse score, different racial groups are all basically alike under the skin. Or when you compare black and white people, you think they are very similar, somewhat similar, not very similar, and not similar at all. So we make a scale from that, and that's our dependent variable. We're going to see whether those vignettes influence those kinds of beliefs. Those are the rest of the items. So it's an internet survey. You can see some of the aspects of the survey. And the hypothesis, the backdoor vignette hypothesis is that we'll have significantly greater belief in essential racial differences than race as social construction vignette or the no vignette, and no significant difference in the belief in essential differences from the race as genetic reality vignette. So when we tell them that the races are different genetically, we're hypothesizing the backdoor vignette to be about the same. When it's compared to the construction vignette, we're saying that the backdoor is going to increase beliefs in fundamental racial differences. And here's what we found. There's a big buildup to a little dippy slide, but here's the slide. And these are the results we get. So the backdoor is just about the health. It's one where no qualifications about ethical issues or racism or anything like that, and the genetic reality. So the belief in racial difference is very similar in those two. So you tell people the races are different, and you give them the backdoor, and they have the same level of belief in racial differences. The social construction vignette is substantially lower, and the no vignette control is also substantially lower. So the backdoor vignette is doing pretty much what the genetic reality vignette does. So this pattern of results holds true across the race and gender groups and across different levels of age, education, and family income in our experiment. Blacks and whites differ only on one thing, and that's in the no vignette control. We can talk about that later if you want. So do the results vary depending on participants' degree of racial bias? So here I am, a good white liberal, hoping that when this happens, it'll only happen to the people that are racist to begin with, and they're looking around for a justification. So can we see whether I can feel comfortable about that? The backdoor effect relies on messages slipping under the radar screen of pre-existing attitudes. So that's saying that if this backdoor thing works, I might be vulnerable to taking up on it. We saw that health-related articles were presented as objective and with little mention of social issues. And is there evidence from the vignette experiments that the backdoor messages are not filtered through pre-existing attitudes? We had an implicit bias measure in the survey, that was done in the survey prior. So we get some assessment, not things that are so influenced by social desirability bias, but these implicit bias tests on our subjects. And what we find is that backdoor vignette elevates racial belief, elevates belief in racial difference regardless of pre-existing bias. So Bruce Link has to worry about this because even, if I conceive of myself as scoring lower on racial bias, it's saying that it's operating just the same for me as people who have high racial biases. So both necessary ingredients for the backdoor eugenics are present: increased number of relevant articles, articles that have hypothesized effect on belief in fundamental racial differences, and it's not confined to highly biased whites. But do these beliefs in essential racial difference really matter? So maybe black people and white people are different, but it doesn't lead to anything else. We argued that the belief in racial differences are key to racism and that increased belief in such differences could exacerbate racism. If not, backdoor eugenics may be real, but not that consequential. Are beliefs in essential racial differences related to other measures of racism in our data? The answer is yes. So explicit racism, for some reason it didn't come out. We could talk about that. That's when you ask people about racism. But implicit racism, there is an association, and especially social distance to black people. And this is the scale there, and it's basically you want to keep separation. The us-them part, if you believe in the racial differences, you're more likely to want to keep distance from blacks. So the conclusion is that the backdoor to eugenics idea that Duster came up with is something to worry about. Articles such as those Duster described have increased significantly over the period of the genomic revolution. Such articles increase belief in essential racial differences. Beliefs in essential racial differences are not isolated, but significantly related to other indicators of racism. And then the final thing I'll say is that this is absent Duster's idea and absent this experiment, this would be invisible. It's just happening. None of us is thinking about it, but it's happening, and it's could be, if we're right about it, it could be reinvigorating some parts of racism in our society. Now, one reaction you can have to that is, at first, well, it was invisible. Geez, can't take responsibility for that. We didn't know what was going on. But my hope is, I just changed that for you. Done.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. We are open for discussion now. Jordan.
That was really terrific and very, it raises so many questions. One thing I wonder about, I have a few questions actually. One thing I wonder about is backdoor to eugenics seems a little stronger than what this is, right? It's backdoor to racism maybe? Okay. And the other thing is, what do we do about I mean, in a sense, it's true that there are genetic differences, but race is a very crude and biologically not particularly meaningful way of drawing distinctions between people. Ancestry is the thing you talk about always in genetics, and it's clearly true that there are genetic differences based on ancestry. That's just a fundamental principle of population genetics, and it's not hard to believe, and in fact there are cases where those genetic differences matter in terms of the prevalence of disease, which in theory could be a neutral, says nothing about racism or certainly eugenics. So the problem, would you say that the problem is the fact that race is a kind of constructed thing, but there has to be some way to talk about the science, I guess, in a way that doesn't induce this, but also doesn't leave on the table, important things that could lead to personalized medicine or differences in risk assessment or things that really actually do have public health significance. And the probability, the fact that some variant might be more common, of course, the problem is that some variant might be more common in one group than another, says nothing about whether those groups are essentially different on some other level or some grand level. So I guess, how do you reconcile the worry about not creating racism, and how do you talk about, what's a better way for us to begin to talk about these things?
Well, I don't know on the how better to talk about it. I hope you guys can help me with that, or us with that. Can we talk about ancestry without linking it to race? If we can do that, that makes a lot of sense to me, because it allows the science. I think it's too closely linked and too easily linked to race at the current time. I go to seminars, people bring it up, I say things because I've been exposed to this, and the people who are doing the investigations kind of act like I just don't understand that we have these ways of getting at the biological basis of race, and what am I talking about? But I think we could do a better job in making it ancestry. The other thing is that we could do a better job in the translation from what we do in science to what comes out into the newspaper, the media about this. We studied media, but not the scientific articles. And that could be done better so that it wasn't so linked to race. That's what I have to say. Joe, do you have anything to say? Okay.
Yes, can I ask a question? Just follow up basically on what was just.
Is he responding to the question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Are you responding?
Yes, I was.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Well, in response to Jordan's question, Troy is a wonderful teacher and has many wonderful students. I don't know if you're familiar with this book by Catherine Bliss called Race Decoded. And what she's essentially urging us all to do is try to develop what Bob would call, or Keats called, negative capability. That is the capacity to think with two lenses at once. So in this particular case, what she is doing is saying, look, if you want to think deeply about what we call race, you have to be able to hold in mind two different ideas. One is that what we call race is socially constructed, and it has been socially constructed in incredibly nefarious ways over time. And we have to keep attending to that, right? And she wants to say, this student of Troy's, we have to think about the ways in which ancestry matters if, in fact, we want to develop things like what is being called precision medicine. So anyway, it's just a sort of amen to the question. I mean, it was a wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask a clarificatory question, but did you want to speak to this issue?
Yes, I did.
Okay,
actually,
okay.
yeah.
I'll ask my question later. That's just an assertion.
Yeah, maybe this is just repeating what's been said, but I mean, I would hope that the conclusion to be drawn from your study is not that there would be areas of science that are going to be off limits because of the potentially negative ways in which results may reinforce racist feelings. Let me put it another way. Might there not be benefit to the groups studied? Isn't it important to know that that blacks have this increased tendency to inflammation so that we can perhaps address this issue at an early stage and prevent deaths in black patients because of their tendency to inflammation and heart attacks at an early age? I would hope that the conclusion is not that we should shut off all sorts of scientific inquiry that may point to biologic differences among people of different races, whatever you want to call it. There are such differences, and how we deal with that information, I think, to me, is the greater challenge, not to shut off such inquiry.
May I ask the question of clarification? So we were just, could we go to the first half of the talk? Would you please, you went through so much interesting information. Could you please say again the bottom line conclusion regarding how genetics does and doesn't exacerbate stigmatization of people with mental illness. I know it's a complicated story, and that's why I didn't, because I think you want to say a way in which it does and a way in which it doesn't. And if you could just say that one more time, I would benefit. I'd be grateful.
That basically it has multiple effects. One, if you think about attribution theory, it tends, on average, if there's an effect of it, and there might not be that huge of an effect. I think when we first started studying, we were worried it'd have a bigger effect than we ended up discovering it had. But to the extent that it had positive effects, it worked through this attribution theory kind of idea of reducing blame, increasing helping, but it had negative effects through things like you've always got it. It's deeply in you. You can't get rid of it. It's hard to treat because those things were negative consequences of a genetic attribution.
If you just add up all the negative and positive effects on different dimensions from all these studies, it's more negative than positive, but not overwhelmingly. So it's all terrible, and then the ways in you can refine it in the ways that Bruce talked about. But this is coming from the point of view, coming from the whole work was coming from the idea that biological and genetic explanations are destigmatizing. So these studies from that perspective that was predominant before our work was that we should find lots of destigmatizing effects. In fact, what we found is on balance, more stigma than destigmatizing, but again, not overwhelmingly so.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, like if the whole idea is that education would be destigmatizing, and that's one of the main goals of that movement, and it's not working, I guess one of my big questions would be, what do you think could work to help destigmatize if it's not, promoting education and the disease model type of thinking?
I think on that, the thing that seems to work best is personal contact. And if you look at what's happened with gays and lesbians over the last 30-something years, and whether the public knows somebody who is gay or lesbian, the prevalence rate of people knowing someone who's been gay or lesbian has gone way up over time. There are not many findings about mental illness, but it stayed pretty flat. And there are some beautiful studies. There's one in Science about gays and lesbians and political canvassing, inducing contact and changing opinions about marriage between gays and lesbians. So there's a lot of evidence showing contact really matters. And so I think that the most powerful approach that we have is that contact. And people, Pat Corrigan, who's sort of Mr. Mental Illness Stigma, has had bipolar illness, and he's come out, and he's produced a book, Coming Out Proud. And he's trying to start a movement to make that happen, to try to change what's true about mental illness, what's true about gays and lesbians, increasing over time, to also become true about people with mental illness. And when you know somebody who's participating, like we just heard it today, it changes people. It has an effect on their stereotypes, and I think that's the best way to change it.
Oh, just following up from Ken's comment and Eric's comment, it seems to me, wondering partly about the definitions and implications of the definitions of racism as a term. So it seems, and I'm wondering, for instance, to me it seems that there are certain things that we're very concerned about. There may be some differences in susceptibility to different diseases, for instance, sickle cell, for instance. But you would hope that would not lead people to act in a discriminatory way, saying, okay, yes, there may be some genetic difference, but that doesn't mean that, I shouldn't, hire someone of that race, for instance. And I'm wondering if you had a chance to look at that. In other words, whether or not the way um, medical genetic information is presented or framed influences people's decisions or views about what we would call social discrimination, for instance.
Well, the best we could do there, I can see, how we could think of other ways to study it. The best we could do there was a correlational link between those beliefs that our experiment showed manipulated, changed, to social distance. It's a self-reported social distance. I don't want to live in the same neighborhood. I wouldn't want to get an organ transplant from somebody who's black. They're correlated to those things. So, I mean, you could demand experimental evidence on that, but we have that observational evidence by something that we manipulate, consistent with something we manipulate. So. Yeah, it was.
Thanks. So I'm just kind of following up on some of the same themes. I think there's been kind of a tendency to think of education as just telling people that everything is due to biology and genetics, and that should reduce stigma on its own. And so it may be that I wonder if the speakers have thoughts about this, but it may be that educating people not to lead them to believe that to endorse genetic attributions more strongly, but maybe to understand better that genetic explanations do not imply, immutability and permanence. I've done some of my own research showing that can benefit that can have beneficial effects on attitudes among both affected people and members of the public at large. So, it's not so much the misconception that these things are non-genetic that needs to be corrected. It's the misconception that genetic explanations somehow imply all of these, misguided assumptions. So I wonder if the speakers have any thoughts about the prospect of using that kind of education to dispel stigmatizing or inaccurate beliefs and attitudes.
Yeah, I think that's super important. Yeah, and it follows just from our results. People believe that it's less treatable if they think it's genetic, and probably psychiatrists here don't that's not true. So I mean that could be changed, but it's what when we ask them, that's what people think. So good point.
I want to go back to a point that Ken made. I feel that historically we have been very cautious about our attributions about race and intelligence, and in fact have really discouraged any kind of testing, genetic testing or whatever, that would demonstrate that there are differences between races and intelligence. And I just wonder whether that is extrapolated with other disorders and mental illness, and the fact that perhaps there is, as I think you're suggesting, Bruce, that there are dangers in showing that there are racial differences.
See, Ruth, I didn't quite get what you're asking me. Is it that we haven't studied it enough? So, I mean, I have one thought about it, but I'm not sure it responds at all to what you said.
No, I'm just, you bring up a lot of very important points, and I think that it's important medically to know that certain races are more likely to suffer from various illnesses. The Bidil medical case where the pill was shown to reduce hypertension in blacks but not in whites was very important. But when it comes to intelligence, I worry that if we are going to continue this genetic testing, if there is a gene for intelligence, that it might lead to very serious social implications and stigma. If in fact we were to find that there were indeed racial differences with intelligence.
Yeah, well, yeah. I've sort of allowed myself not to worry about that yet, because I feel that the social psychological inquiries, studies about stereotype threat and its influence on test performance are likely so strong that they can explain the differences on the observed tests. So that I don't think I don't think you're going to find the genetic thing, because I think those processes are good enough to explain the differences. But if it happened, it would be a huge thing, and how to deal with it would be a huge, especially in a society that carries so much weight of racism around with it. If you found that one, it would be big trouble.
Did you want to make last comment? We can make one last comment. I love your comment.
Thanks so much, Bruce. That was a really fascinating and really important work that you're doing, I think. I also am thinking about stereotype threat while you're talking about this work. And so I think you did a great job demonstrating that making these connections between health and genes and race leads to people seeing these larger, more fundamental differences between racial groups, and sort of having this expansion of beliefs about fundamental differences. But it seems to me that the fundamental differences, like the DVs that you had, maybe the health piece could be encompassed in the fundamental differences. And I'm more worried about sort of more normatively tinged fundamental differences. So would exposure to these kinds of connections between genes and health and race lead to sort of triggering stereotypes that are things like African Americans and violence or something like that? I wonder if that would be an interesting follow-up project, or if you've thought about that, not only in people who aren't part of that racial group, but people who are within that group themselves. So could this kind of like public information drawing these inferences or correlations be even more harmful in sort of a moral sense, do you think?
I'll see if I get this right, but I think that's Troy Duster's hypothesis. We tested one part of it, but his idea is that if the public sees that it's associated with heart disease and racial differences in heart disease, racial differences this and that, they'll conclude, well, why not violence? And why not IQ? And you know, and that they'll generalize to those things, especially in the context of a racist society that wants to believe why blacks are lower down is because of those kinds of things, that it kind of like snaps into that racist content. But you're right, we didn't show it, and it could be a follow-up.
I want to thank you all very much for participating in this conference, and I want to remind you to fill out the evaluation forms that are at the back. It's really important to us to know what you thought. So thank you very much, and have a great day.